Welcome everyone to the third and final day of the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative's Grower Conference. I think that we established this is number 13. I hope I'm remembering that right. All I can say is when I was thinking this morning, I'm like, I think this is my fifth. So I don't know what that means, but maybe I'm a regular now. Today, we are going to start out with an introduction from Mike. I think you're first up, but before that, a little housekeeping. We will be using the Q&A for questions today, so please do not use the chat when you come in. Address all your questions, the Q&A, and folks, the panel, the facilitators today will monitor that and get your questions answered either in that box or live. Anything else from Linda or Anna that you want to make sure we cover with the participants before we get started?
Just to note to everybody, did you say, sorry, Connie, I'm like working right on the side here. Did you mention that it is being recorded, all three sessions? So we will get those up as soon as we have them edited.
And all attendees, there will be a survey that will be probably coming out early next week. So please take the time to fill out that survey and let us know how things went, what you learned or what you were excited about learning today and the past presentations, and help us form our future workshops, field days, and conferences. So with that, I will pass it on to Mike Lilia, who will be sharing information about his production.
Thank you, Connie. Good morning. My name is Mike Lilia. I'm chair of the American Hazelnut Company. To say a few words about the AHC. And as the opener of today's festivities, I will not be a hard act to follow. And as Jason yesterday pointed out, trying to emulate the actual conference atmosphere, I have been drinking too much coffee during the day and too much beer at night. So I just feel right at home. The HC was formed in 2014 by a number of hazelnut growers who had mature plants and more nuts than they could process themselves over the winter. The purpose was to create a processing and marketing company to help drive the demand for Midwest hazelnuts in the market, and in turn increase the demand for growers and plants on the land. Unfortunately, sales have not kept up quite with that, but they have been increasing, so that is a good thing. The HC is here both to create a company and help promote the develop the upper Midwest hazelnut industry. I also hope we have a little influence in helping other geographic areas, as I've gotten to know people from other parts of the country doing the same thing. AHC is currently made up of both grower and investor owners, with vast majority being growers, as we also want to help growers succeed. That is one of the primary things we're trying to do, is make sure that growers also succeed. We work in collaboration with universities of Minnesota and Wisconsin, and Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin. University of Minnesota, with great input from Connie Carlson, helps with our marketing, and Jason Fischbach of University of Wisconsin on the processing end. Also, great kudos go to Lois Brown at the U of M for her dedication to the entire industry for her work with plant selection and breeding, and Dave Bonhoff at U of W with his work with mechanical harvesting and other aspects of processing. We're currently working with Northland College through a grant from the state of Wisconsin to help develop new products. And lest I forget, AURI, a Minnesota organization to help optimize our flower processing, which is one of the things they're helping with us right now. They have helped with other things in the past. The HC purchases husked nuts, and I want to just make sure that that is emphasized. We don't buy in husk, we buy nuts that have been stripped of their husks from both members and non-members across the upper Midwest and beyond, if anyone is looking for a market to sell their nuts. We process them into whole kernel, flour, oil, and puree. And the puree is the fines left over after the oil settles. Oil was our #1 seller until COVID, and then with the home baking, flour became our best seller. Until recently, we did not have many Midwest kernels and did not market whole kernel too strongly. But that is also beginning to change. We're selling more whole kernel, and our need for nuts is ever increasing. Shells have been a tougher market, but if some of the various ideas for those turn out, we will be able to sell every part of the nut that comes to us. Because we work out of a licensed and inspected facility, we can sell into any market, including retail, bakers, restaurants, and to large food operations as an ingredient to large, sorry, you know, you work on these things and you still come across as reading things, but sorry. Large food operations, which we can then sell as an ingredient to them, which opens up opportunities to sell to a large audience. Paul Ronsheim is going to talk a little later in detail about processing and the equipment, but I do want to say we're quite proud of our new oil press, and it appears will help increase our capacity. As mentioned earlier, we're primarily a grower-owned company, and we buy from both members and non-members. Currently, membership is a one-time fee of $1,000, which gets you a 25-cent premium in pricing and priority of selling nuts to the company over non-members. After the one-time buy-in, you can either elect to receive payment for nuts in the form of cash or ownership units. I'd also like to say a big thank you to Linda Meschke for her work with this conference and putting this list of points together for me for my spiel, since I should know it, but sometimes these things just don't come to mind very well. So she gets lots of kudos for that. With that, if there's any questions, I would be happy to try to answer any.
All right. Mike, we've got a question from Leslie. She says, or he, excuse me, what's the demand for the products?
What's the demand? Well, there's, I guess I don't, that's kind of a broad question in my mind. Currently, we're selling some oil to primarily through co-ops, but also on our website. Flour had become quite high demand when COVID hit because people were staying home and baking. We sell the puree to a maker of specialty confections, who's a keto manufacturer of confections in St. Paul. That's primarily where our products end up going.
I'll share some detail on that too in my presentation coming up, more so on where some of the products are going and some of the interest. We've got a question from Thomas. He asks, how much do you pay for nuts?
Currently, pricing is $1.55 per pound in shell for member pricing.
Excellent. Charles asks, what's the current volume of sales?
We are a little over $20,000 in sales right now.
Good. Steve asks, any specific food companies you have contacted and hoping to work with?
We have had contact with a couple of different companies, some nut companies, some local large manufacturers of cereal, but unfortunately, we are not able to provide high enough quantities for them to have any serious conversations.
Yeah, and again, I'll share some of those, some names too in my, yeah, and if Steve or anyone else on this call has some great ideas, please don't be afraid to put them in chat or let us know after this. We're always, it's all hands on deck for marketing. So any help this audience has, we'll take it. Aaron asks, what is the best way for someone outside Minnesota or Wisconsin to get nuts to you if they wanted to sell to you?
Best way. Well, the easiest way for me is if you package them up and ship them to us. But I have actually offered as part of one of the ownership benefits, if you become a member of AHC, I will pick up nuts until you guys get your cluster formed and can then create a shipping opportunity. And yeah, so if you're not like 3 days away, I would come pick them up if you're a member for now, until either you're large enough yourself or until you have your grower cluster together.
Rebecca asks, you mentioned that you pay $1.55 per pound. How has this price varied over the past several years?
Actually, excuse me, it's actually been fairly consistent. We started off at $1 a pound when we first got going because we were matching what Oregon was paying, which has been approximately $1, give or take a little. We then raised the price because quite frankly, there's a lot of labor involved with this, and this still is a necessity to support the farmers. At the same time, we can't pay too much because the company still has to make enough money to pay its bills too. So we've been at $1. We were at $1.50 for a few years, and then the last, I think, 2 years, we've been at $1.55.
Sue asks, Hormel added a nut butter line a while back. Are they a prospective buyer?
They could be if, again, we can create enough nuts. The big problem with the industry and the AHC right now is there are just not enough nuts to be purchased and then forwarded on to other companies as an ingredient.
Steve asks, individual farm husking is problematic at this point. Have you considered renting or sharing a mobile appropriated scaled husking unit?
Yeah, again, as a member, that was part of what service I had volunteered to offer. Is I do now have possession of a husker, and if you don't have, say, over 100 pounds of nuts, I can come help husk and transport your nuts to Gay's Mills for initial inspection and cleaning, and then up to Ashland for primary processing.
Brian asks, any market for organic products?
I think there's a lot of market for organic products because our industry is still so small and we have such a varied amount of growers. We can't market directly as organic because there's just not enough to be had whether they're organic or not. So from what I've seen in the marketplace, I believe there's a lot of demand for organic, but that's not going to happen until we have a large enough growing base.
Can I just add a comment there? Most of our growers, or all of our growers, our members, grow in an organic fashion. So they aren't using pesticides or chemicals in the production of their hazelnuts. They're just not certified organic. So the product's probably organic per se, but they're not certified organic.
Exactly. And then there really isn't any processing equipment in the upper Midwest that would be able to do certified organic processing. So so that's a challenge yet too. But I'll also add that some of the early companies that we've talked with have asked that question, you know, can we get organic hazelnuts? So I think Mike is right in that eventually down the line, that will be maybe a premium market for hazelnuts.
Correct.
Rebecca asks, what volume of nuts do you purchase in a year, and how many member grower acres do you have?
Grower acres, I couldn't answer because it varies from, say, example, Mark Shepard, who's got approximately a 100-acre farm, although I don't believe he's completely covered on that 100 acres. So that's a tough one to question. I think Jason Fishbach can answer that a little bit better. And what was the second part of the question?
How many member growers? I'm sorry. Volume of nuts do you purchase? What's the volume of nuts?
Volume of nuts. Well, we've been generally purchasing everything we can get our hands on. And I think last year was something over 2,000 pounds that we purchased of Midwest nuts.
This year was 3,500.
There you go.
Nice. Way to go, Paul. You have a fan. Stephanie Thompson would like to buy an American Hazelnut Company logo poster and sweatshirt. So when you get merch, get it online because
I do believe
fans.
we do have vests. So
there you go.
We don't have a lot. We can't keep a lot in stock at this point, but we would be happy to take orders for future purchases when we put an order in for new merchandise.
There's a question, is the Gaze Mills kitchen certified organic?
I don't believe so.
Okay. And just for anyone listening, Gaze Mills, the kitchen there in Gaze Mills, Wisconsin is where the American Hazelnut Company processes their nuts and meal and things. So that's what that reference means. Brad Nemechek wants everybody to know that we do have that the American Hazelnut Company has 2 women's vests in stock. So Brad, if you can put a link in the chat to let people check out the American Hazelnut Company website, that will help people navigate that. And Leslie asks, why is the retail price $15 per pound so different? Not entirely sure what they're asking. Do you know, Mike, what Leslie's asking there?
The retail price.
Oh, yeah. So
what they're asking is if we're paying $1.50 a pound or $1.50.
I got you.
The retail price. But it's getting that little kernel out of the shell.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll go through that real quickly, and now I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
So currently, the nuts we're buying are approximately 1/3 kernel weight by pound. So if you buy a pound of in-shell nuts, which is what we purchase as in-shell nuts, you buy a pound, you get approximately 1/3 of a pound of nuts. So if you extrapolate that out, say 10 pounds, you're going to get approximately somewhere between 3 and 3.5 pounds of kernel. And so the problem is we're paying $1.55 a pound for in-shell nuts. Once we take those out, we have already paid about $4.65 a pound for kernel. That's before processing. So now you have to add processing costs in there. And the costs there include cracking them. Back up. There's incoming inspection, cleaning, sanitizing, cracking the nuts, and then separating the kernel from the shell, and then final removal, which is just hugely expensive because of the labor to separate the shell from the kernel. Jason Fischbach and Dave Bonhoff, who have done a lot of work to help improve the efficiencies of our processing, that's helping get the cost down. But because of the fact we're already paying somewhere close to $5 a pound for kernel before we've even taken it out of the shell, and then you add all that processing cost on there, that's why there's such a difference between what we pay in shell prices and the final retail price of a pound of nuts.
Nicely done. Brad corrected me here. He let us know that the KCC, the kitchen that we were talking about earlier, has been certified organic for specific products. So there is a certification there for specific products. And then Jim asks, how much does production have to increase to access larger markets?
From the numbers I've heard, I'd say probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 times, because there was some discussion with, I believe it was Mars, they're looking for like 10,000 pounds a month or 100,000 pounds a month or something like that. It was a huge number. And that's kernel. That's not in-shell, that's kernel. So we would, and then to supply any of the other things we're doing, we had, I think somebody talked with General Mills at one point. You know, they're in those same kinds of numbers, 10,000 or 100,000 pounds a month. So it would have to increase a lot. But the good thing is there is interest in purchasing local product. So if we can get more plants on the ground, and I don't wish to step on anybody who's growing seedlings, but quite frankly, the production is going to happen when we can get the cultivars in the ground, and we see a little increase in terms of shell to kernel ratio, and when we get people growing thousands of acres of hazelnuts instead of tens of acres of hazelnuts.
We do have a couple of questions in the chat.
Yep.
And I'll read them off.
Okay.
Do you dry the nuts?
Drying the nuts is primary responsibility of the grower. So you would harvest them, then husk them and dry them. We look for a moisture content of around 6 to 8%. So you'll have to spend a little time drying those as well. But that's typically not too difficult. And if necessary, when things come in, well, I don't want to say that because we don't really have drying capacity at this point.
So they just air dry the nuts.
Correct, just air dry. There's no,
Beneficial.
you don't have to buy like a big corn dryer or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay. Another question. What does the sanitizing step look like? And I know that Paul and Jason will probably be talking about this in their presentation. So maybe just something quick for right now.
Yeah, just real quick. All we do is we pretty much just sort of dip the nuts in a sanitizing solution, and then usually to dry them more quickly, we put them, and that's the sanitizing moisture. We put them in the oven to dry them that way.
That was all in the chat.
Okay.
Great questions. I think a number of those questions again will be answered again through the rest of the presentations today. It should give you a good idea of marketing and processing that is underway. Anything else from the audience that you want to get answered? Oh. Who is buying? Ronald asks, who is buying from the small farmers with less than 1 acre?
You mean like who's buying nuts? We
Yeah,
would
I
be
think so.
buying. Yeah, we will buy nuts from you. As I said, that we'll buy nuts from both members and non-members. There is a premium for pricing for members, but we'll buy nuts from people who are not members as well.
One comment I wanted to add, and I maybe Mike said this and I forgot, but the processing of the American Hazelnut Company is done in a licensed kitchen, both at Gaze Mill and at Ashland. And so that's the only licensed processing here in the Midwest. And so for sales to go to like restaurants or bakeries or to sell online, retail, you need to have them processed in a licensed kitchen. And so we do have that ability. So that's unique to us. And you know, if you're just selling at your local farmer's market, you don't need that. But if you want to sell to the retail, you need to have that.
Charles asks, how many members in AHC?
I was going to email Brad the other day and ask him that to get up the latest update, but I think there's 25 or 26.
And Paul says yes, so good. We got backup on that one. And Jordan asks, do you buy wild nuts?
Not typically. Part of the reason for that, again, is because of the relative kernel to shell ratio, and because they are so small, I don't know that we can crack them and process them efficiently. We have that problem right now with the hybrids. The smallest ones are difficult for us to process. So no, the wild ones we don't buy unless you happen to have a source of, large nuts.
So we are looking for nuts that are larger than, I believe it's 11 millimeters. And so if they're smaller than that, we don't want them because they're too hard to crack and sort. And it's not worth the time it costs to do that tracking and sorting. And Mike, maybe you could just confirm, is it 11 millimeters and up? What we're looking for?
Right. Jason has in the past purchased some smaller ones that through a grant for the pig feed trials, but we as a company are trying to minimize that. I typically try to screen mine through 1/2-inch hardware cloth beforehand to separate the smaller ones, but technically I believe 3/8 is closer to that 11 millimeter size. The problem is I have yet to find 3/8 hardware cloth. And so that way I just minimize the amount of small kernels that I ship. So that's a good rough screening there.
All right, Steve asks, can the grower agreement be made available for review for prospective grower owners?
Yes. There's a link on our website where you can request information. You will first be asked to sign a non-disclosure, and then we can send you the information about the company.
Excellent. If someone can put the link in the chat again for attendees, they can click on that and have quick access to it. All right. Any more good questions from the audience?
Well, thank you very much. Those were all great questions. I guess they're going to kick me off now because it's 9 o'clock and the real party starts. So look forward to seeing what else that people have to learn and say to this afternoon or later this morning.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Connie.
Greg, were you going to jump in, or do you want me to just continue the show? You're still muted. Oh, you have to.
You can't hear me now, can you?
I can now. Yep.
You can hear me now, huh?
Yep.
Okay, I see. So the mute goes through my computer, even though I'm connected via phone. All right. Well, thanks. I'm glad to be here finally. Next up, we'll have Connie Carlson. Connie Carlson is the co-director of the statewide Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems team for the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships, or RSDP. RSDP is a University of Minnesota extension program focused on connecting greater Minnesota communities, growers, and innovators with the resources and experts at the University of Minnesota. So Carlson's work is focused on developing market opportunities for the suite of crops in the University of Minnesota's Forever Green Initiative crop research program. Forever Green is developing new crops and cropping systems that provide continuous living cover and provide new economic opportunities for growers and businesses. And hybrid hazelnuts have been part of this research program for many years. So with that, please take it away, Connie.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Again, great introduction from Greg, kind of gives you a real broad overview of what I'm working on. But what I want to leave you, if there's anything I want to leave you with today around what I'm going to be talking about, is that there is a whole contingency of people in the upper Midwest who are working on scaling up the markets as the new crops that are being developed, such as hazelnuts, come into production. So what I'm hoping to share with you today is what that work looks like and how we are moving along in the process to get these crops to growers and out into the market. So let's see if we can get my arrows to work here. There we go. So as Greg said, I am part of the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships. Oh, sorry. We are an organization, an extension-based organization that works to connect greater Minnesota with the expertise and resources and innovations that are coming out of the university. Greg and I actually co-direct a statewide team that supports projects all over Minnesota. And our focus is on sustainable ag and food systems. And so here's just a quick snapshot of the work that we had supported in 2019. And I look at my work as really this bridge. Greg, myself, and many others in our extension work are really focused on moving that innovation and carrying it along until it gets to the end user or grower or business or innovator who really wants to work with these new crops or innovations coming out of the university. The Forever Green Initiative is a platform of crops that are providing new economic opportunities, as well as providing environmental benefits to growers. So really developing new tools for farmers and growers to protect our soil, protect our water, and build a more resilient soil and soil health. So I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted because there's a timing issue on my presentation, so I'm sorry about that. So I recently joined with the Forever Green Initiative to support their marketing of these new crops that are coming out of the Forever Green Initiative. And so I continue to stay in my role with the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships, being part of that network of sustainable ag and food systems work. But I focus my time on the Forever Green Initiative crops, and of which those include woody perennials, and hazelnuts are part of that portfolio. So, Forever Green is launching this portfolio of crops that include hazelnuts, and my work is specifically focused on how do we develop the markets for it. And hazelnuts have long been part of the Forever Green Initiative. Don Wise, who is the founder of the project, co-founded about 20 years ago. Hazelnuts were one of the first crops in the portfolio. And they are recognized because of that perenniality. They provide that continuous living cover. As we have, talked about with this crop for a long time. It keeps the soil covered, provides habitat. That root system protects water and soil. And so there's a great benefit for having these woody perennials on the landscape. And so this is what my role looks like. They brought me on to do this specific work around market opportunities. And I am partnered with someone named Colin Carlson, who's focused on supply chain. And so together, we work on not just hazelnuts, but a whole platform of crops, like that previous slide showed you, about 16 of them, all of which have, they're at various readiness for commercialization. So some of them we're working really intensely right now, and some of them have, 7, 10, 15 years of development yet. And my work is really focused on market identification, developing end uses, working with companies to identify where they might incorporate these crops into their current product development, and fostering relationships to continue to do this work as these crops progress. And in my work, I am seeing a considerable interest in these crops and the environmental benefits, the ecosystem services that they provide. I do have conversations with a range of industry, such as Cargill, who are really trying to figure out how they are going to meet some of these very public goals that they have put forward about reducing greenhouse gases, improving their supply chains, and promoting soil health and regenerative ag. General Mills, another partner that we've talked to very publicly, has talked about reducing greenhouse gas emissions across their full supply chain, and have put out some very aggressive goals. And what we're finding is that they don't always have solutions for this. So they are looking to researchers at universities and even other companies and entrepreneurs to really develop some of these solutions. What I find is exciting is that they are also, these companies, large and small, are also continuing to communicate this to their audiences. So I always like to put this piece up, because here's a food company on their blog showing you a giant clump of soil with a good greasy worm in there, and just continuing to share with consumers, their audiences, the importance of soil health. So when they carry that message forward, it makes our work, people, researchers and folks who are developing these new crops that have these ecosystem services, helps us to really communicate the benefits of what we are doing. But companies are also, they are doing this because they are responding to us as well. So there's this a little chicken and egg scenario that's happening. Consumers, go through a varying decisions when they are making decisions about if they're going to purchase a product or not. And what you see on the left here are some of those decision points that consumers make as they're deciding whether or not they're going to purchase a peanut butter or even a car. And traditionally, that gray part, the price, taste, and convenience, has always been part of the equation. People want to find the best price. When they're talking about food, they want it to taste good, and convenience is a very big part, and it will always be part of their decision-making process. But that right side of that circle, the blue and even the green around the circle, really indicates the shift in how consumers are making decisions and where additional priorities are for them. Health and wellness, safety, social impact, and experience with it. So, positive or negative. And then around that circle, transparency. All of these are also weighing into how consumers are making decisions about the products they want to buy. And on the right side of the screen, you'll see an article that I captured prior to COVID that was looking at, trying to forecast what we were going to be doing and what the trends were going to be in 2020. And we're still seeing a lot of this despite COVID. And this is not, these are not things that are going to go away. This is not a fad. Consumers are moving in this trend. This is a place where they're continuing to be when they want to make decisions around products and food that they purchase. So social value, health and wellness all continue to be important as they make those decisions. So Forever Green crops, we are providing new and unique food ingredients, and this is very exciting. And there's a wide amount of opportunities. Our oil seeds have potential for bioplastics, and our hazelnuts have a range of opportunities that might be available to them. But the challenge is that they are unique and they are new. And so many of the pieces need to be put in place yet for them to even be put into the market. So, and pieces, by that I mean the infrastructure and supply chains to harvest, store, and move the crops into the market. And so when I'm working with companies who are exploring these new products, they often go through a pretty extensive discovery process. And to determine whether or not this is an ingredient that they want to work with. And the process that is on the right side of the screen here kind of shows the steps. And in a traditional sense, when they're working with an existing product that has an established supply and a supply chain, it's typically maybe about a 14 to 20 month process. And this is when they know the market price, when they know they can get a consistent supply, when they know the nutritional composition or even how this ingredient functions. When all of these knowns are present, they can take the crop through or ingredient through a process and determine whether or not it's something they want to incorporate into their business. But let's take a peek here quickly around hazelnut production. So Mike's discussion this morning, I think, highlighted a lot of the uncertainties, unknowns in hazelnuts. And here's a quick bullet point list of all of those unknowns. You know, we still are trying to identify that ideal plant and get it propagated. There's no commercial production, so there's limited acres and there's limited supply. There's limited harvesting options. The supply chain is somewhat ad hoc. You know, Mike is saying, I'll drive to your farm and pick up your nuts. There's limited marketing and communication efforts right now, and price discovery is still underway. So these are all this unknowns that when you compare it to what companies need, you can see that we've got some work to do before we can truly scale up hazelnuts. So what do we do? How do we create or accelerate even supply chains and market demand for these crops when there are so many unknowns? And the phrase we often use in this is this chicken and egg scenario. We need companies to develop and launch these new products so that they can spur the market demand for these new crops. So we need them as partners. But they need that affordable, consistent, plentiful supply so they can plan for products and so they can research and develop and launch them. So my work and that of Collins and Jason and a number of other people that you've heard from the last 3 days and will hear from after me, the work we do in this marketing right now to accelerate it is the work we do is we develop these partners, we identify products, we do collaborative piloting R&D and information sharing. So these are all the tools that I use and my colleagues use at this point to serve as this bridge between the research and development and the end use. So the work is all about reducing the unknowns. And when we do that, markets can grow because markets need good information to grow. So I'm going to take you through example of what one other crop is happening with one other crop in the portfolio that I work on, Kernza. And I'm going to also kind of show you the work we've done. And then after that, I'll show you how hazelnuts are in parallel, are doing some of the similar work that we're seeing in Kernza. So Kernza is a perennial grain. It's the first perennial grain that has been commercialized in the United States. University of Minnesota released its first variety in 2019 called Minnesota Clearwater. This is the first perennial grain available for commercial, and it has this deep root system that builds soil health. It reduces nitrates and protects water. The composition of this grain, it's similar to wheat. It has a higher protein than wheat, and it behaves similarly to wheat in product development. And currently, there's about 1,000 to 1,300, 1,500 acres planted in Minnesota and about 4,000 acres planted nationally. So not a crop that has a lot of acreage yet either. But what we know, one of the most important things that we've learned about Kernza is its ability to protect our water. So research has happened over the last 5 years to really see what happens when you plant Kernza in wellhead protection areas, areas where water flows into public drinking water sources. And what we are seeing is that when it's planted, it greatly reduces nitrate leaching into the soil and water. So the yellow line on the bottom here shows you the Kernza, the nitrate leaching through the production system in comparison to corn and switchgrass. So you can see it's quite dramatic. And in fact, in a meeting the other day, I heard it was about 99% effective. So it really does the job. And so we're taking that idea and we're strategically planting Kernza in vulnerable water areas, across in these particular areas in Minnesota, but really there's interest across Minnesota in how they can incorporate Kernza into areas to protect our water. And from there, we are developing clusters of production. And this might be a familiar phrase to you because we were talking about hazelnut cluster production as well. And the idea is the same, is that we want to aggregate and create these value chains in these areas where growers and businesses, supply chains and processors can work together to expand and scale Kernza and hazelnuts and our other products, but specifically here Kernza, into these cluster productions. And from there, what we have developed working with the Minnesota legislature is a program to pilot Kernza in these areas and provide the support that growers and industry need to scale up. So not only we're really de-risking this work, not only for growers, but for those businesses and communities that want to work with us. So we are launching this pilot program within the next month. And what it does provide is payments to growers, upfront payments for their ecosystem services, and then an aftermarket payment. So if they have a total crop failure, or if they take Kernza to the market and don't get a competitive price, we kind of fill in the blanks for them. And this is all piloting to see how communities can get engaged and really test out this cluster process. And one of the other important pieces to all of this is that this program also provides technical assistance to growers. So providing access to growers, to university researchers, or even other experienced Kernza growers, so they can be successful in their production and really get their questions answered and help them be successful growing Kernza. So at the same time that we are launching all of that, we are also in the process of developing that supply chain. So my colleague Colin and I are heavily involved with partners such as Perennial Pantry, which is a small startup entrepreneur company that actually developed their own processing equipment. We are partnered with folks from the Friends of the Mississippi River, who are an NGO that supports us through policy development. We have 3 seed companies who have come on board, and we continue to identify other seed companies who may be a good fit for processing and cleaning Kernza. We work closely with AURI, which is an Agricultural Utilization Research Institute. They're a Minnesota organization with 30 years of experience of bringing Minnesota agricultural products into the commercialization process. So they've developed technical specs for us and application bulletins. We have cleaners and processors coming on board for cleaning and processing Kernza for food grade applications. And we are continuing to identify entrepreneurs across Minnesota who are interested in working with Kernza. And in addition to that, then my work is really focused on how identifying some of these companies that can serve as these early, mid, and long-term partners in working with Kernza and developing product. So in my work, I think of these in near, mid, and long-term scenarios. And with Kernza, we're probably in that mid-range, between near and midterm, based on the supply chain. So this work is really focused on, what kind of product can I get to a company and how much of it can I get to them so that they can work and plan. And so for Kernza, we have some startup processing, like I've talked about. We have some seed supply there, and we have growing supply. So 5 years ago, we were working with a lot of the folks in that left side of the screen, some brewers, some restaurants who had some flexibility with their menus and were really able to kind of work with the fluctuations of supply. now that we have a more consistent supply, or at least we're able to forecast and kind of provide a little more consistency about what companies can access, we're moving into this mid area where companies are developing crackers or pastas or other products that can have some shelf life to them. And none of this work on this screen, none of this is linear. It's not A and then B and then C. Because while I am talking with Birchwood, I am having conversations with Cliff Bar and General Mills and other companies, so that when the supply gets to the place where it needs to be, and when processes are in place, and when a supply chain has been optimized, those larger companies will be able to jump in and more fully participate. So information sharing, as I said, is really important. And even when there isn't supply, providing companies that I highlighted in that previous slide, providing them with spec sheets such as this that was developed by AERI are very valuable, because that will help the companies understand how the grain will operate, or how it compares to wheat in product development. And we have spec sheets like this for cleaning and processing Kernza. We have it for baking with it, and for some other applications as well. And I think it's important to note that the entrepreneurs and some of the smaller scale partners in this have been really critical in moving Kernza forward in the last year. I want to highlight Perennial Pantry here. This is Christopher and Brian on the left, and they jumped in about a year and a half ago, developed their own processing equipment, and were really the first to market in the country with flour and whole grain, which you can now get in the last week. Lake Winds Co-op, which has 3 stores in the Twin Cities area, are now stocking Kernza flour and whole grain on their shelves. So these partners who are really values aligned, they understand the environmental benefits and can really tell the story of what we're doing, are really important to our work at this point in the process. Last thing I want to mention about Kernza, then I'm going to move into hazelnuts very quickly, is that there is a multi-state project underway that really brings together everything I talked to and scales it up across the country. So you can access information on this project at this website and at kernzacap.org, and learn a little bit more about how partners doing similar work that I'm doing are now coming together to build out Kernza across the country through this federal funding with this Sustainable Ag Systems Grant, which we like to call the Kernza Cap. So let's get into hazelnuts here.
Hey, Connie, I got a couple of questions real quick, if you don't mind. What year did the Kernza and your partnership start?
Kernza started about, the crop came into the portfolio of crops about 2010 or 11. We partnered very closely with the Land Institute on that research. Land Institute was working on it about 10 years prior to that, and they got material from Rodale. So there's quite a history to it.
Great. And then Linda's looks like typing an answer to another one, but maybe you also have an opinion here. Many of us got into hazelnuts because of its high unit value. When it goes large scale, won't the price per pound received by producers drop precipitously?
That's likely the story, and that's what companies are waiting for. Just the other day, we were talking about Kernza, and someone asked us, why are these companies waiting to participate? And everyone in the comments said price, price, price. So I think that's why it's really important for us to continue to foster these relationships with these entrepreneurs that I mentioned, these people such as Christopher and Brian, or American Hazelnut Company, who can tell the story, garner that premium, And at this scale, with this, at this stage, really tell the story of what this crop is and build that value. But yes, you're absolutely right. As this crop becomes more commodity crop, that becomes the challenge. So I think many of you know about the benefits of hazelnuts. Many of you are working with it. And you understand, like I said, the environmental benefits. Health-wise, the hazelnuts have a high oil content, high in linoleic and oleic, which are heart healthy. So there's a real great health story to tell, and that the global demand for hazelnuts continues to grow, and that the supply, that demand far exceeds supply. So there's a market out there. Just a repeat of the environmental benefits, and I like to put these lush green pictures up side by side with the Oregon production. So you can see, you know, the production that's happening in the upper Midwest has some real environmental story to tell about keeping that soil in cover and promoting wildlife habitat, and really a great story that consumers resonate with versus the production that we are often seeing in Oregon here. And the story, you know, no matter what with hazelnuts is a positive one. This is an article from The Guardian about a year ago that really talks about hazelnuts being a rising star around pulling carbon from the atmosphere, and that they are really important for a number of things, including water conservation. So the story to tell around these nuts is very compelling. And a slide from Jason that really shows that, you know, when you look at this, oh, you know, the United States doesn't eat a lot of hazelnuts. But as someone who works in marketing, I think I see an opportunity here, real market growth that can happen around getting people from the United States to eat more hazelnuts. So grower clusters, I highlighted the Kernel grower clusters. That same work is happening with hazelnuts. There's a grant that is supporting developing clusters of growers across the upper Midwest. Jason talked about it earlier in our conference. And again, this is going to be how we continue to build out efficiencies in the supply chain, share good information between growers, and build up the base for upper Midwest hazelnut production. Information sharing will be really important, and there's already pieces out there for growers to access to make decisions and really understand what it means to get into hazelnut production at this stage in the upper Midwest. So good information for growers. And the supply chain work is underway as well. You're going to hear about this from, hear more about that processing from Jason and Paul later today, to really showcase the steady work that is happening around optimizing the supply chain, building in more efficiency so we can lower that price to market, that lower the cost that it takes to get to these hazelnuts to market. So hazelnut product identification, I talked about what I have identified for Kernel, and it's the same thing for hazelnuts. We're still in that near-term opportunity areas because our supply chain is pretty non-existent really at this point. And so we continue to focus on, you know, the, sort of the job shop range of people involved in the process. So American Hazelnut Company, very important in all of this. They actually have retail products. There's restaurants are very interested in these in hazelnuts at this point. And we're starting to see some interest from retail co-ops. Small co-ops are a really good target market for some of American Hazelnut Company product. But that work is still in that near-term area, mostly because of consistency of supply. As things improve and we increase that supply and increase the efficiency, we'll be able to move further to the right on this and work with granola companies and nut butter companies and regional and even national CPGs, consumer packaged goods. Just a repeat here, I wanted just the health attributes of the hazelnut nut are compelling to consumers, and there's a lot of applications for the hazelnuts in the food area. The oil and flour are very competitive products, and flour, as Mike alluded to in his talk, did see a real surge in interest over COVID with baking. And because it's a gluten-free product, there's a lot of interest there as well. So eventually we hope to be working with companies like Gustola Granola, who are very values aligned. Angela has continued to be interested in the process and where we are in hazelnut development. And when supply is right, she will likely come on board to continue those conversations about how she might be able to incorporate regional production into her enterprise. And I always find it exciting to read her statement, because she really does get those ecological benefits and how that will benefit not only the environment, but her company as well, and that her customers are looking for this type of product. I'll repeat that American Hazelnut Company continues to do great work around providing some product for various market channels. So they are in restaurants and retail co-ops. They have considerable they have a web presence and are selling the oil, meal, and nuts in all of these areas. They are in, there's some competition though. This is a snapshot of the shelf of oils that are available to the consumer. So you can see that there's quite a challenge to break into that oil market and really stand out. So that work is ongoing and takes a lot of resources and time. And there's a lot of fits and starts, especially around continuing to make sure there's a consistent supply. But you can find these oils at places like Lakewinds and other co-ops. And lastly, in regards to the American Hazelnut Company, they are involved in a Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection grant to develop some additional products. And I have been working with them, American Hazelnut Company, on a flavored hazelnut snack pack. So at this point, recipes have been developed for a hazelnut snack. And we sent these hazelnuts to, these flavored nuts to a handful of culinary professionals to provide some feedback on these products. And now we're in the process of costing it out and determining what size packages will be provided and where they're going to be marketed. Likely starting with web presence, but this is developing more products and moving hazelnuts more into the market. Just so you know, the photos here are not the packaging that we're looking at, but I wanted to give you an example of some potential products and what they might look like and how they might be packaged and the volume that they might be packaged in. So a lot of work here to explore what might be done for hazelnuts and new products. But this is very exciting and really grateful for Jason and his work securing this grant. And you can buy a hazelnut chocolate spread that uses hazelnuts grown in the upper Midwest. So the American Hazelnut Company, when they process nuts, have a leftover product, a byproduct that they look for a name for. I think we settled on slurry, I think. Puree, maybe that's it, puree. Sounds a little bit better. But this puree contains a bit of oil and a bit of nut meat in it. And this company, Lavella, tested it and found that it was a good application for a hazelnut chocolate spread. They have, so Lovella has had this on the market for maybe the last year or so, mostly through web, and they buy this puree from the American Hazelnut Company as it's available. So very exciting, and a great way to incorporate a byproduct and provide a value for the entire nut as it's processed. So last slide, and what I want to leave you with is that this is an all hands on deck process for bringing these new crops into the market. And that includes you as eaters, so and in your kitchen. And so there are resources for how you can work with hazelnuts, and we have culinary professionals like Beth Dooley who are writing about working with hazelnuts and talking about them with media and really encouraging consumers to understand this hazelnut research and how they can participate. So she just recently launched the Forever Green Cookbook, and in there are these recipes that have been tested, tried, tested, and true. And you can access this cookbook on that website listed at the bottom of the screen. And again, people like Beth really carry the message forward of what we are doing and help support all of the work we are doing to push consumers to understand what we are doing and support our work. So with that, I just want to shout out to the funders and partners who help make my work happen. Could not do this without them. And here is my contact information. So I encourage you to reach out to me if you have additional ideas, suggestions, or ways to support this work. And with that, I will leave it and answer any questions.
All right, great. Thank you, Connie. Let's get some questions going here. It seems that an AURI spec sheet for hazelnuts would be really handy. Is this possible, and when in the timeline would this be useful?
It would be absolutely. It would be very valuable. AURI has actually done a little bit of analysis at this point on the flour, and because there was some interest in using the flour and seeing whether or not it would be applicable for brewing. And anytime in the process that we're able to get some of that analysis, it would be timely, because it would be information that could be provided to industry right now, so they can think about it. So some of that work is underway. A little bit has to do with funding and availability of just availability of funding to make that happen.
Great. Here's another one from a panelist, so it doesn't show up in the Q&A, unfortunately. But where is the chocolate and hazelnut chocolate spread being sourced? I've recently become concerned about fair trade chocolate, given stories about abusive labor conditions on cocoa farms.
Oh, what's exciting about Loves is that they work very closely with the farmers who are producing the cacao for their product. So I sat and talked to Ilya, the owner, for a good 2 hours about the work he's done to promote sustainable farming and production where he sources the chocolate. So rest assured, good work is happening there.
All right, thank you. Here's another one. Can you tell us what flavors are in the snack packs?
Oh, oh, you know what? I think we're gonna wait on revealing that yet, unless you know what? I will actually leave that. If anyone from the American Hazelnut Company wants to share that information, I'll leave that to them. If they can post it in chat, or because it's not my product, it's their product, and I'll leave that to them to decide. But they're delicious, sweet and savory. Yep.
All right. Great. So a comment, maybe a question. The organic market will support better prices to growers. If growers really are using organic prices or practices, they should get certified. It's not expensive and they can access the organic market.
Yeah, right now the premium in organic continues to hold, and we see that across the markets. It'll be interesting to see how things progress as this regenerative conversation picks up. So I think there'll be a lot to watch. But at this point, organic production would likely get a premium. And I'm not a hazelnut grower, but since most of the production already seems to adhere to organic practices, it would seem that it would be a natural thing to do.
Okay. Hey, Connie, I'm going to have to cut us off here. If you're able to throw some answers into the Q&A as we move on.
Yep. And I think then we're handing it off to Jason.
All right. Yep. So onward to Jason.
Good morning, everyone. I was just going to a few slides here to provide some information regarding the quality, if you will, of the kernels coming off existing hazelnut plantings. And it's always hard to, present this data because in some ways there's a time lag, right? So the quality of the kernels coming off our existing plantings is from genetics that were planted in, 10 years ago. And so what's the quality of the kernels on the plants that you might plant today is going to be different. So what we present, what we know, and we, put in the caveats as necessary. So let me just provide some, and here we go. We're going to fix that. So the data that I'm presenting here is coming from the producers that are scattered, are part of the American hazelnut companies scattered across primarily Wisconsin is where we've been getting the nuts so far, but some from Minnesota and also some of our research plantings. So it represents a lot of different growing environments, and it represents a lot of different genetics. Some of these are plantings that are 20, 25 years old. Some are, just came into production in the last couple of years. And if you, the question is size, right? Are these hazelnuts large enough? Because if it was just a matter of finding productive genotypes, we could go in the wild and find some nice American hazelnuts because the yields are pretty high. But are those kernels and nuts large enough to economically process, and are markets looking for kernels that small? So this size question is always one that we've been looking at. And this just shows the in-shell nut size distribution. So generally, you can see each of these lines is one individual farm in 2019. So they sent me all their nuts, I sized them, and this is what the size distribution looks like in terms of the in-shell. Now, the equipment that we've had, we sort on the minimum dimension, but the grading standards that are used, say, for the USDA marketing orders are based on the medium dimension. So if you think of an in-shell nut or a kernel, think of it as 3 dimensions, top to bottom, and then the 2 side-to-side dimensions. So this is sorting on the minimum dimension of any given nut. Okay, you can see there's a fair amount of variability from plant to plant. But if you look at the average over the 2018 nuts that we received, 2019 nuts we received, and 2020 nuts that we received, you can see they all follow, on average, roughly the same size distribution. So most of the nuts that we grow right now in the upper Midwest are between that 12 millimeters and 14 millimeters in size on the minimum dimension. Okay, so I don't have the USDA standards on this slideshow, but suffice it to say these are small, smaller than what they grow in Oregon. So if you're trying to compete, let's say in the in-shell market in China, you have a very different product. Obviously, that's not what we're talking about right now, but the point is that these are relatively small nuts still coming off these production systems. And it also gives us a snapshot of, okay, this is what we have to work with. So this is what we're going to try to sell. This is how we're going to build the industry, at least initially. So it's just good to know these things. So now we know roughly the size of the in-shells. The other question is, what's the quality of the product coming off these plantings? And a lot of this is depending on the genetics, but a lot of this too is just how good are the growers? How conscientious are they about harvesting the product, getting it dried, getting it cleaned, right? And so, blank is genetically controlled. Doesn't do us any good to grow in-shell nuts that don't have a kernel in it. Again, part of this is genetics, and some varieties have really high blank percentages. But with our seedlings, we have so much variability that generally blanks aren't a problem. Now, take some of this data with a grain of salt, because growers are doing some sorting and cleaning on farm before they ship the hazelnuts. And so when you're aspirating, say, off the shell fragment, some of these light blanks are going to get pulled off. So our actual blank percentage is probably a little bit higher. Deformed or shrunken, and this is a challenge because if we've got genetics, again, that are really diverse, and those plants that are maturing really late and maybe too late for our environment, our climate, those kernels won't fully develop. And so we've had this concern that if we're really pushing the envelope there, do we end up with misshapen and small kernels? So that's one part of it. I would say, yes, there's a small component there, but the bigger issue that we're finding is that growers are picking too early. It turns out that kernels do their filling and convert the moisture and the sugars to the oils and proteins very late, like literally the last couple of weeks of the ripening window. And if you pick, because you're trying to avoid blue jay predation or something, you pick too early, when those nuts dry, because of the moisture content and the lack of the solids, is you get shrunken kernels. So we'll see some variability across plantings when they come in, but generally on average, we're still manageable, but this could be improved. The other one is mold, right? Moldy kernels are not good from a food safety standpoint, and typically they're moldy because growers didn't dry down the nuts fast enough. This has not really been a problem because growers, A, are picking off the shrubs, not off the ground, and B, in order to get those nuts out of the husk, they have to dry them down. So they're air drying them, they're in greenhouses, they're laid out in the sun. And so we're getting low enough moisture percentages fast enough that we're really not getting much mold. This question of how small is too small depends in part what the market is, but it depends in part on the technology that you have available in order to crack the nuts and separate those shell fragments from kernels. And the issue that we run into in our processing here in Ashland is that you have to do that final hand sort to get that last little bit of kernel out. And if everything is smaller, it's really hard for fat fingers and human eyes to do that effectively and cost effectively. So it's way easier to hand sort that final step by hand when everything's larger. So we tend to use this 12 to 11 millimeter in shell size as sort of the cutoff of what, and the rest goes to pig feed that's smaller, but it's not a lot, right? So we typically have the capability to process what we grow right now. And on average, roughly, 80 to 90% of what the in-shell nuts that are produced in the Midwest are producing a good kernel, at least from the sampling that we've done. So that's good. Okay, so this shows the kernel size distribution. This was a batch of hazelnuts that were just shipped from our facility down to Ashland, or down to Gaze Mills for the American Hazelnut Companies just this week. And these are in-shell nuts in that typical range from 12 to 15 millimeters. So it encapsulates sort of not the tiny end and not the large jumbo, but that 90% of what we grow. These are the kernels that come out of that mix. So this is the kernel that we grow in the upper Midwest right now. And again, we're sorting on the narrow kernel dimension, and you're going to see this is some interesting stuff that's coming out of some of our analysis here, but generally it's in this 9 millimeter range. And so the question is, well, what does that mean? Does that matter at all, right? And so there's sort of this, okay, well, how does that fit into the general marketplace? So I did a little research, right? We always hear about Ferrero Rocher, maker of Nutella, and of course these candies that have exacting specifications on the kernels that go into their products. And if you can't meet those specifications, don't even bother selling to the world's largest user of hazelnuts, right? Which obviously at our scale, we're nowhere near going to do. And I think there's an argument to be made that as a grower, you're probably not in your best interest to sell to these big companies because your pricing is going to be driven down, 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 down. Regardless, in terms of understanding the kernels that we grow and how it fits in the marketplace, I think it's interesting to at least look at what these specifications are. And I decided to do this the old-fashioned way, and luckily I have 4 kids, and so we bought a box, and we ate all the chocolate around the nuts and pulled out these exacting standards that they have. And here they are. They look a little slimy because that's spit, because we had to, kind of like a sucker, get the chocolate off. So these are the 9 millimeter Midwest grown, and these are the Ferrero Rocher. And it's interesting when you measure these things, they are pretty exact specifications. All 3 dimensions are within 1 millimeter, around that 12 to 13 millimeter mark. You'll note they've blanched them, but they're not all perfectly blanched. There's a little bit of pellicle left on them. But generally, yes, the hazelnuts that we're growing are smaller than what Ferrero Rocher is using. Not a surprise, we kind of knew that, but I think it's interesting for folks to see it visually. So if you look at this on this is 12 millimeter, right? And so what we're growing does not fit the specifications for Ferrero Rocher candies. Okay, move on, right? So then the question though is, that's the minimum dimension. That's the equipment that we sort on right now. And it's interesting, if you run those kernels, now this is not that same batch, this is a different batch of kernels, but generally it's representative. And you run it through a round hole sizer, now we're sorting on the middle dimension. And you can see that the size dimensions of our kernels shifts quite a bit, simply because we're sorting on a different dimension of the nut. And now you compare that to the dimension of the Ferrero Rocher shown in this red line, and we're kind of in that wheelhouse. But here's the thing, you might say, why? Why, if we're sorting in the narrow dimension, are we so much smaller than on the middle dimension? And the reason is because the nuts that we grow in the Midwest, the kernels are not round. If you crack them through and you take a close look at them, for the most part, you're certainly going to find some round kernels, but they're either oblate, meaning if you had the kernel and you kind of squished it from the top to bottom, think of it that way, or they're long. So in general, of those three dimensions, there's always a pretty pronounced skinny dimension, if you will, right? That they're sort of have a skinny profile, whether laying on their side or up and down. And so that is an attribute that we have. It's something that certainly can be addressed through breeding. But if you just look at the middle dimension, we meet some of these decent specifications for, say, the Oregon kernel. We're in that small to medium size class. However, because they're not round, somebody like Ferrero that wants an even roast on their kernels and it needs to fit their processing equipment specifically, right? They're not going to meet the grade because they're of that non-round dimension. So I thought that was interesting. So then I just wanted to line these up with some of the other promising selections, right? Because what these blue lines are showing the nuts that are grown from all the seedlings and mixed together. So here are some promising selections. And you can see how the nut size compares. So if you look at Northern Blaze, for example, this is out of the Grimo program. It's pretty similar in size, but actually some of these improved varieties are too big compared to the Ferrero, if you will. Again, that's all relative, right? And the material that we're producing, the UMHDI program from the Badger Set program, is still smaller. Now, who cares, right? There are other attributes besides size. So I did a very informal taste testing with my 4 kids and had them rate which flavor they liked the most. And I'll show that in the red votes. Northern Blaze, ARB43, and Marion all got 1 vote. And the 4th vote, she said, she's 13. And so she said, gross, they all taste like ladybugs. I don't know what to do with that information. But you'll notice, right? And if you saw from the data that Sue presented yesterday, you noticed she pointed out the bitterness component of that flavor, but she didn't point out the intensity of the aroma, which rated higher than the European selection. And so we know we've got some interesting flavors, and I would argue some superior flavors in these. So size isn't the only question. Okay, so what is our, if we're selling, whether it's to Gustola Granola or we're selling to Mars or some other company, right? At some point, we have to be thinking about what is our value proposition? What is it that we offer that the American or the consumer can't get elsewhere? And right now, it's fresh, local, sustainable. And the story of hazelnuts, I think, if you look at a bag of these American hazelnuts and you eat these, you're going to notice each one's got a little different flavor. Maybe that's the value proposition, right? They're not uniform, they're different. But we need to be thinking about that. At some point, though, as we reach scale and those of you that have maybe never made a value-added food product, maybe this is kind of a foreign concept, and you might think, well, why can't they just buy whatever I grow? Well, if you're a value-added producer and trying to make a consistent product, you want a consistent ingredient supply so that your customers can get used to eating what you produce, right? You need it to perform certain ways in your processing. And so at some point, we need to be thinking about having consistent other attributes to the hazelnuts that we grow. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to have one variety, which is the concern, but we do need to be thinking about these things in terms of dependability, kernel quality, price, sizing. But we've got opportunities in the ingredient market. So if we can't meet the exacting specifications of a confectioner, well, we can grind them up. We can press the oil out. We can make flour. We can slice and dice. And, so there's all kinds of other ingredient opportunities, but we need to be thinking about the quality of those ingredients too. So one last slide. I want to go back to this Ferrero example, or two last slides. So our sort of knee-jerk reaction, I think, as early adopters of hazelnuts is we are so in love with the hazelnuts that that's what we want to sell, just hazelnut, pure hazelnut, right? And there is certainly a market for that. And we're really small scale and our cost of production is really high. If we're going to make any sort of money, we have to put those prices through the roof, right? And we hope there's enough customers willing to buy it to make things go. I think the American Hazelnut Company is finding, yeah, this sounds good. And, you know, we can go to farmers market and talk about how much we're selling pricing wise. But if you look at volumes, now that's what, 30 acres of hazelnuts. And if we're trying to make landscape level changes on our landscape, we have to figure out how to sell thousands of acres of hazelnuts, whether they're in the most diversified polyculture you can imagine or orchards is out of the question, you know, is certainly important, but we're talking about scale. So let's look at the Ferrero example. Maybe instead of selling pure hazelnuts, we have to start thinking about selling other products that include hazelnuts. And so let's use the Ferrero Rocher chocolate example. So here are the ingredients off the back of the package. And remember, there's one hazelnut per candy. So they are selling a lot of cheap ingredients and they're selling some fancy packaging or the brand, right? So if you look at that package, it's, you know, it's pretty fancy for what it actually is. If you look at the ingredients. So we just did a little bit of number crunching. So I paid $5.99 for those 12 chocolates at Walgreens. Obviously that includes Walgreens markup, the distributor markup, everything along that value chain, but that's what I paid. That's the retail value. And I paid that for, you know, one way to look at it is 12 whole kernels. That's what I got. And those 12 whole kernels weighed 11.7 grams, which is interesting, right? Because most of those hazelnuts weigh 1 gram, which tends to be the industry standard. So if you do the math, that works out to, I paid $232.43 per pound for those kernels. Or if you scale that up just to make the numbers look impressive, I paid $464,860 per ton for hazelnut kernel. Okay, so it's the power of adding cheaper ingredients and fancy branding to sell your kernels for more money than what you would get just selling straight kernels. So I think that's where, you know, as the industry develops here and people get into this, they start realizing, well, maybe we can't just sell pure hazelnuts. We got to mix it with something else.
All right, thanks, Jason. There might be time for a question or so. If we run out of time while questions come in, we'll continue to answer them in the Q&A box. Give a second here in case anybody's frantically typing. And in the meantime, I will introduce Jeff Jensen. So Jeff is program manager for the Working Watersheds Buffers and Beyond program and is field coordinator for Northwest Iowa. He has a bachelor's degree in communication studies and has worked in the field of sustainable agriculture for the past 15 years. He has over 13 years of experience working with landowners and farmers growing perennial crops and is active with several existing organizations and partners, including the Iowa Nut Growers Association. He grows nuts and berries on his own farm, Nut Haven, in north central Iowa. Thank you, Jeff, and take it away.
Okay. Can you see that, Greg?
I can see that. Yep. There we go.
All right. Well, excellent. Thanks everyone for allowing me to come and finish up here with weed control and orchard maintenance. I got a haircut, so I look less like a bum, but that's all right. You're interested in the content that I have here today. So real briefly, we're going to talk just a little bit about after we planted, how do we protect our investment? And so if it's a presentation by me, so we're going to talk about goals because that's always the most important, and then just some maintenance basics. So again, what is your goal? So if this is an agroforestry planting versus a production versus research and backyard, at the bottom of that list, the research and backyard planting certainly is going to have a lot more emphasis put on weed control and management and perhaps more costly. Something like an agroforestry planting where we're doing a field windbreak or a shelter belt or something like that might have relatively little maintenance if we're not particularly interested in the nuts, or the nuts are a side function of the actual agroforestry practice. So what is your goal? That's going to make all the difference in the world in terms of the investment that you put to maintain your orchard or maintain your planting. So watering is certainly a crucial step, and we want to be watering our plants those first 2 years. Those seedlings are going to need 1 inch of rain per week, so 5 to 10 gallons. I put the case for conservation because this is where mulch can really help. Covering that soil can really help it from getting dried out. In the areas that we have our plantings here in Iowa, there's a lot of wind turbines in Iowa, a lot of wind, so we have to be cognizant of that. And that mulch is really going to keep the soil and the moisture in the soil, pardon me. And there's many different ways to do this. So for instance, if you have access to a well that's got good pressure, you could use something like drip tape irrigation. That's a relatively cheap system that can put the water right where it needs to be and does a good job of conserving water and not overwatering. If you don't have access to a well or the pressure necessary for drip tape irrigation, 5-gallon buckets are the old standby. And so here you can see the drip tape irrigation put down on top of the landscape fabric. Sometimes it goes underneath the landscape fabric, just depending on how you set your system up. You can see though, with this landscape fabric, we do have the mulch that's put down over the top as well. Here's Wally the water wagon, and me and Wally have spent a lot of time together, let me tell you what. So this is at the Strucker Joint Performance Trial. I live just about a half mile up the road. You can see it in the background there, my farm. And so 500 gallons at a time goes down, and in 5-gallon buckets and through the water wand, each of those plants gets watered. And again, 5 to 10 gallons every week. So last year in 2020, we were basically, with the exception of 3 or 4 weeks, we watered from from July 4th all the way through the middle of September, every single week. It's just what it takes. So we got to get water on these things to protect our investments, especially if it's going to be a research planting where these are such valuable genotypes to begin with. And again, 5-gallon buckets, 7-gallon buckets. The orange ones are a little bit taller with 7 gallons with a small hole drilled at the bottom, allows that water to come out at a relatively nice pace and not cause problems. And it's not wanting to advance. Oh, just a little slow. Okay, let's talk about weed control. This one is important. So why are we controlling weeds? Well, sod and grass is intense competition, period. Stop. I would rather have weeds like thistles and buttonweeds and you name it than sod and grass. They compete for water. They're gonna just cause all sorts of problems in terms of competing with your crop. So there's a couple of different ways, many different ways actually, that we can control these weeds, and we're going to talk about a few of them here. So let's understand that mulch, wood mulch is great. It's relatively cheap. We can put it on pretty thick. Typically, I like to see it 4 to 6 inches, and basically a foot or two outside of that growing area of the little seedling. Sometimes it can be challenging depending on the mulch. You know, there's all sorts of types, whether it's the nice chips, whether it's some of the shredded stuff. All of that makes kind of a difference, but ultimately just get something down on the ground, conserve that moisture, try to keep those weeds down. And yes, sometimes you're going to have weeds that'll grow up through that. Pretty easy though to either spray around the edge of that mulch, that wood mulch, or actually when the weeds grow up through it, just pull them out or whatever the case may be. Now, landscape fabric, we talked a little bit about this the other day, and so this is a discussion. So landscape fabric is great. It has its uses. In this particular case with the research plantings, we have 4x4 squares. They've got stakes in each corner as well as each side. And these did not have wood mulch over the top of them. My recommendation is if you're going to use this practice going forward, that you do put wood mulch over the top of this landscape fabric as well. And notice that when I use the term landscape fabric, I'm using that very specifically because what we're utilizing is a woven fabric that does allow some moisture to get through. It's not like it's plastic, black plastic, where nothing can get through. And mind you, it's not like this woven fabric is a sieve either. I mean, water does tend to beat up and kind of roll away. But the point is it does let moisture penetrate through the woven fabric. It's not like it's a sheet of plastic. So it's very different. And then of course your landscape fabrics can be in many different dimensions or thicknesses, I should say. And There are some bad parts to the landscape fabric. One of the reasons I say that we should have mulch on top of these squares is because the wind blows through and can eventually loosen up those stakes. And then that landscape fabric in a big wind event can actually rip away and potentially damage your plants and rip plants out of the ground. I mentioned that a system like this, we're putting mulch over the top of them, is going to be even better because we get the best of both worlds with the weight of the mulch on top of that the fabric. One of the things here is a lot of time that medium, that mulch can start growing grasses and weeds and stuff like that in that mulch as the medium. And so again, you just got to pick those out through your monitoring efforts. They pull easily because the root systems don't have a chance to actually get into the soil, but it's just the root systems that are growing in that mulch itself. I mentioned the difference between the types of landscape fabric and the way that we, not the types of landscape fabric, but the way that we lay it down. So in this particular case, with those edges that are buried, this is going to be ideal because it's really going to eliminate the suckering where those shoots, are going to come out to the side and then up and try to grow on the outside or within the row, I should say, the alleyway. And so if you can do this and you're utilizing landscape fabric, it's the way you want to go. Certainly, it does require the use of a machine like this to lay it and get it tucked in there real nice. But if you just lay it over the top of the ground and you don't bury it, you will be subjected to then having to control those suckers. Now, it's not necessarily a big deal. We just mow them off. We literally ride the lawnmower 1/2 over the landscape fabric, 1/2 over the edge of the grass, and whatever suckers come up just get mowed off, and that's how we manage it. If you don't, depending on your mowing regime, sometimes those you can miss one or two and they can get to be pretty big and you got to go in and prune them out. But again, that's nothing more than just your regular pruning activity, maintenance activities, monitoring your orchard and stuff like that. But if you are going to use landscape fabric, just understand the pros and cons of it. Cost is obviously the most prohibitive. A roll of 250 feet long, 6 foot wide landscape fabric is about $123. Certainly you could slice that in half if you only wanted to use a 3 foot wide, but it adds up. Incidentally, if you get a 250 foot roll, you cut it into those 4x4 pieces, you'll get 62. So that's about $2 a mat. And then you'll also have some money into the stakes. And so for right around $3, give or take, well, not $3, it's about $2.70 some. You can put down a 4x4 piece of landscape fabric with the stakes and be good to go in that regard. Although I would suggest putting the mulch over the top of it. Let's talk about weed control with chemicals. So certainly glyphosate was used on most of my plantings early to spray right around the plants themselves. Another one that a lot of professional foresters will use is something called Oust XP, and that has both a pre-emergence and then a residual to it. However, that's more for the advanced growers at this point in time because Oust does require some very specific, you have to have a very specific calibrated sprayer. You can only be using like 4 ounces per acre, and you can only really use that twice per year. The maximum is 8 ounces per acre. But it does provide, again, a pre-emergence and a residual that is pretty outstanding. But glyphosate's, again, a relatively easy one that most growers are going to have access to. It's a contact, so whatever actually hits the green material is going to kill it. Most folks are familiar with it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Control of woodies. So one of the biggest issues that I have is just mulberries and other woody species that grow up within the hazelnuts themselves that need to be cut out, and then those stems treated with some sort of a control. Again, you don't have to use a chemical. You can continually prune them out until they eventually just die. But if you do want to treat that stem, Garlon 4 and Transline are 2 options. I would stay away from Tordon, however. I learned my lesson very early, utilized Tordon the first 2 years to just treat some stems, and it killed some plants. It got the death halo. What happens to Tordon, if you get any moisture and it kind of leaches out, it can cause some problems. So there's better options than Tordon. Tree tubes. Real quickly, let's just have a short conversation about tree tubes. And the first thing to understand is they are tree tubes. They are not pieces of drainage pipe. So I am referring to tree tubes that have been designed. So Plantra is one that's a name brand that many folks know. It's fantastic in terms of it has the slits in it to facilitate air. It's not going to heat up your plants and kill them in that regards. You can get them in various sizes in terms of heights and widths. And I think that for the money, they are excellent and are worth it for wind protection alone. I cannot tell you how impressed I've been with plants that have tree tubes on them. That little microclimate allows them to really grow and facilitate good growth from that plant. Sometimes without it, the wind blows so fiercely. We don't have protection on the north and the west of this research site here. And so it can really desiccate plants and be a problem. But putting that little piece of tree tube around it is fantastic. Of course, the cons are they do cost something. So a 5-foot tree tube is retail about $5. If you do buy them in bulk, you can get them around $3. Of course, we cut them in half so that they're, instead of 5 foot tall, they're 2.5 feet. So that helps on the cost as well. There is some concerns with rubbing the stem at the top of the tube. The wind can whip around that plant and lead to rubbing where it can be a problem. It certainly requires monitoring and maintenance. So you can't just walk away from the tree tubes because they have weeds or grass that'll grow up inside of them. It's a great microclimate for those hazelnuts, but it's a great microclimate for everything else that grows, right? And then of course, in the wintertime, it's a nice little home for mice. It's protected. They can feed on that stem if they need to and chew on it all winter long. So you just need to be cognizant of that. And so monitoring, essentially whenever I'm out watering, I'm also checking tree tubes, lifting them up slightly to see if any weeds have been growing up and then pulling them out and so on and so forth. So again, tree tubes I think are a fantastic option. They do cost something and they do require a little bit of maintenance. And of course, remember that we're talking with about shrub hazelnuts. So tree tubes aren't going to be appropriate for all of the seedlings that we have, the multi-stem seedlings. So they're really more conducive to single stems or, you know, the first year or two of that single stem growing while the other multiple stems might come up. But keep that in mind as well. We're only putting these on single stem hazelnut plants right now. If it's multi-stem, we're putting a little cage around it. Well, when we talk about pruning here, again, we need to know what the goal is. What are we trying to do? And so there's certainly removing those dead and what I call spent limbs that have produced really well, but are on the downside now. Then there's those damaged and rubbing limbs. And I'll show a few pictures of that in just a second here. And then for my part, I like to prune up those low growing branches as well. One of the things that I like to do is take the lawnmower, the push lawnmower, and push up underneath this kind of hedgerow. And so what I don't necessarily want is a lot of low hanging branches. So I'll try to prune them up as best I can. Of course, we have damage sometimes. So snow can really do a number on hazelnuts. You get some drifting in the orchard and you get that freeze thaw action and it can just snap off stems and just destroy plants. I mean, it could really be a problem. Then there's the whole rubbing of you know, these multi-stemmed, a lot of folks have seen these multi-stemmed bushes. You can see that just has tons and tons of stems of various sizes. There's always new ones growing up. And so you get a lot of this rubbing that occurs. And of course, that can be a problem for longevity. So just getting those cut out of there so that we can minimize those crossing branches. And then the time to prune. So keep in mind that after pollination is when we typically want to be pruning in our orchard here because we want to facilitate good pollination. So not cutting out during the winter time when we might have a little bit of lag time. We might need those male catkins that are on some of those branches that we want to prune out. And so typically waiting until after pollination so that we get as much of that pollen out there as possible, and then going through and doing our maintenance pruning, corrective pruning, or taking bushes out that are not productive anymore, whatever the case may be. There we go. So another issue that I want to strongly encourage is monitoring that planting. So it's easy if we have to go out there and water every week to monitor the planting because we have to do something while we're filling the water buckets and wait for them to drain. But even if we get plenty of rain, we still should be at least every other week, whatever the case may be, walking through our orchard to ensure that we're monitoring for pests. If there is some drought happening, if there's weed problems that are developing, if there's dead plants, just getting that notated. You know, Japanese beetle, it was mentioned as, or maybe it wasn't mentioned as a pest, but Japanese beetle are a problem. Can be a problem, let me repeat that. I haven't had them on my farm. Let me take that back. Last year, 2020, was the first time I saw a single Japanese beetle on my farm. But they've been at the Marion research plot down by Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I know of another grower out east in Charles City, Iowa, that's really struggled with them. They've just completely laced out the plants. So it can be a problem, that's for sure. So here's a great example of some wild grape. And so what happens if you don't monitor on a timely basis? Well, this was from a couple of years ago. I didn't monitor appropriately, went on a 3-week vacation and came back and was like, holy moly, I've got a problem. So got out the pruning shears and started to really whack away at this wild grape that had completely overcame this hazelnut bush. So part of monitoring, it's just important that we get out there and we keep track of what's going on so that we can take any corrective actions as they come up. So real briefly here with orchard sanitation and maintenance, one of the things I like to do after harvest is just raking those rows to remove any of that leaf litter, the nuts, any of that stuff, so that we have a nice clean floor going into the winter, coming into the spring, certainly removing any of those broken or damaged branches. Pruning after pollination, so key. And then cutting back that landscape fabric is, as you can imagine, as that plant grows bigger and bigger and bigger, and that whole of the landscape fabric is a certain size, it'll start cutting in and actually cutting off the circulation and can kill plants in that way. So that's another important step. So here's what it looks like when we have a well-raked and clean orchard floor. There's no leaves, there's very few nuts that are left out there, and it's just looks nice, I guess. This is a necessity for one of the plantings, Hazel Acres, which was the very first planting that I put in, because this is on my parents' farm, and my mother wants her farm to look like a golf course, which is unfortunate, but it's what I have to deal with. And so getting everything looking nice and clean is important. My house does not look like a golf course, but we still rake the rows because we want to keep all that stuff cleaned up and get those nuts out of the way and leaf litter and stuff like that. I mentioned cutting back that landscape fabric. Certainly that hole is going to be small when we start, but as that plant grows and develops and that crown continues to grow, if we don't cut around that landscape fabric, if we're using it, it's going to choke off that plant. And that's it. So I'm open to any questions that folks might have.
All right. So some questions. What size hole works for bucket irrigation?
Yeah, I should have, I don't know. I got to look at my my drill set. There is a magic number and I don't know what size it is. So stay tuned. Sue, yeah, we'll get that to you.
All right, thanks. My organic certifier requires removal of fabric or plastic prior to winter, which is another laborious step. So question or comment, think maybe a comment. If you have a comment to the comment.
No comment. More work.
Okay. Is the landscape fabric and or the stakes biodegradable? And do you need stakes if you use wood chips on top of the fabric?
Yeah, great question. They're not biodegradable. They're metal. And so instead of buying actual retail stakes, I'll go to the hardware store and get a 50 or 100 foot roll of wire and make my own. And they are not biodegradable. They do rust, as you can imagine, but they're there. And so long-term, they would have to be removed and cleaned up. So great question.
All right, and do you need stakes on the wood chips?
Yeah, great question. Yes. Well, let me take that back. The 4x4 squares, you're still going to need to stake every single corner, minimum of 4. You can maybe get away from the other 4 on the edges if you put heavy wood chips on them. But I would not simply put wood chips on top of landscape fabric without connecting it to the ground because it can tend to shift. So absolutely.
All right. How long are you leaving the tree tubes on?
It depends. Basically until we get too many stems for multi-stem, to make a difference. So basically the first year or 2, I would say. And incidentally, one of the things I did was the tree tubes are on over the winter time. last year we did take them off about mid-season. I wanted to just see, I was curious, I guess, more than anything. And so we took them off. I want to say it was probably mid to late July, left them off, and then came back in the fall and put them back on. And, but typically I would just leave them in that tree tube the whole year round. So I wouldn't necessarily do that, if that makes sense.
Were there problems with sunlight? Too much sun getting on those leaves? I mean,
No,
not been used
it
to
was
this.
too many weeds. It was too many weeds growing up in the tubes.
Got it. All right. So what do you recommend for stakes with the tree tubes?
Again, if you don't want to spend an arm and a leg, go to the hardware store and get a 50-foot roll of 10 gauge wire, 12 gauge wire, something like that, and make your own stakes. You make them whatever size and length you want and however deep you want, and works real slick.
All right. Let's see. Lois has a comment to one of the questions too, I think. Let me see if I can find you. All right, Lois, you can unmute and add a comment if you want.
I'm actually, my brain is so full of so many questions, I can't remember what I was going to comment on. Yeah, there's so many things. I can answer questions too if people want me to.
Oh, I thought you wanted to answer a question live.
I did have a specific question and somebody else has repeated it. He says, what is the problem with Tordon details, please? And I'd like to know as well, because I'm considering using Tordon on stumps of, not Tordon, but Garlon on stumps of hazelnuts that I cull, and I don't want it to translocate to neighboring ones. So there are two questions. One is, what is the problem with Tordon? And then the other one is there a problem with Garlon translocating to neighboring hazelnuts if you use it on stumps that you've culled?
Not to my knowledge with the Garlon, yes with the Tordon. The Tordon, the issue was it killed, cut mulberry volunteers out, treated them with the Tordon, and it killed the 2 hazelnut bushes right there. That happened in 2 other places. And so just talking to some forestry friends of mine, and they said, yeah, Tordon is notorious. If it gets a little bit wet or something like that, it can leach down and give the death ring, they call it the death halo, and kill stuff around it. And so I've just moved away from it. There's other better options that are just as effective. Now you can still use Tordon. We still use Tordon on the farm. It's not like we don't use it at all, but we just don't use it next to the hazelnuts or anything that we care about.
All right, let's get some of these questions mailed out here. Can you explain watering with the 5-gallon bucket pail with a hole? Do you give 1 bucket for each tree, or do you move from tree to tree, and how many holes or how fast does it take to empty?
Yeah, great question. So each plant gets a bucket, 5 or 7 gallons. It's got a small hole drilled in the bottom of it. You put a piece of rock in there or something to weight it down so the wind doesn't blow them away. And you fill up that bucket, and usually within 10 to 12 minutes, depending, you can go move it to the next plant, rinse and repeat. And you do that for 80 some plants.
All right. Can worms pass through that landscape fabric?
No, it's pretty tightly woven.
Do you have hazelnut weevil problems when you use landscape fabric? Do you see less weevil damage?
So it was a fascinating, my favorite talk so far has been the Hazelnut Weevil talk. So I have not seen that little critter that Shayna, was that who gave that talk? Haley, pardon me, Haley. However, I think that I have the filbert worm, which looks similar, and I have seen it looks like a little moth, and I have seen those. And so I can't say that the landscape fabric one way or another, because I don't have any landscape fabric at my first planting, none whatsoever. The second planting do have the landscape fabric, and I've seen the filbert worms in both. And so I can't make a definitive one way or the other if the landscape fabric has had any sort of an issue or not. I will mention real quick, someone asked about voles, and that is a concern of mine, especially at the Lawrence research site down by Cedar Rapids. where toward the end of the year, oh my Lord, I was blown away at just all the tunnels that were being formed and the lifting of some of this landscape fabric because they were making some homes underneath there. And so I'll have something to report this spring, I'm sure, to see if it was an issue or if it wasn't an issue, but that one is a concern of mine as well.
So one of the pruning photos showed almost all old stems cut back. Is this recommended for rejuvenation on a schedule, or is partial field rejuvenation each year?
You know, this is probably beyond my pay grade. I think a lot of us are trying to figure that out. There's all sorts of different pruning regimes for various fruit crops. And so, you know, that could be a possibility, and I think ultimately will be down the road. At this point in time, it's basically just those crossing branches, you know, because they're causing damage anyways. And so if we can get them out of there, and then I like to, you know, sunlight is fruit. So if we can improve the sunlight penetration and really kind of thin out some of the inside sometimes of our bushes, we can improve our yield. But ultimately, it's in my mind with seedlings, it's all for naught, because you don't know if it would make a difference if we had cultivars, because then we would have that consistency to be able to see if it makes a difference or not. But just generally speaking, the more sunlight you can get, the more fruiting buds you're going to have and the more yield you're going to get eventually. So.
All right, there was one that got answered in text, but maybe you have a comment also about the organic matter, removing the organic matter from the orchard. Wouldn't the organic matter be good for the soil and for the plantings?
It's not that much. I mean, it's pretty minimal. And for me, I think it's just worth it to get it out of there. And again, I don't know if it's worth it or not. And ultimately in a production system, are we going to be raking all of our rows? I don't know if it's going to be worth it or not, but I just think it's nice because it, you know, you can get quite a few nuts that just fall off of the bush and are just there. And then, you know, again, with that whole cycle of the pests and stuff, it sounds like when that nut hits the ground, those pests are getting out pretty quickly. So unless you're raking every other day, maybe it's not worth it from a pest cycle standpoint, but there's other benefits as well. So I think it's worth it. But again, each individual is going to have to make that decision on their own.
All right, let's see. Have any studies been done of the cost benefit for more or less weed suppression efforts?
Well, I can't speak to any. Oh, Lois is typing an answer. Good.
Oh,
Yeah.
should I go ahead and answer?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I did a study on that, and the results of the study are posted on the website. They show a clear benefit to weed control efforts. And in fact, my research combining nitrogen fertilization in a factorial study with and without weed control shows that weed control had a much higher benefit than the nitrogen fertilizer. The bulletin that I wrote is a little bit out of date because we wrote it at a time just showing growth responses because those particular plants hadn't yet started to bear nuts. We now have that information, and so I'm going to try to update that bulletin this winter or maybe next winter since spring's already here. But basically what it shows is that the weed control produced larger plants, and then the larger plants had yield within a genotype was proportional to size of plant, and therefore the larger plants produced more. And that effect carried on even 3 years after we discontinued the weed control efforts. So that's highly suggestive that it's cost effective. The specific question about the cost benefit depends on so many other variables that we couldn't evaluate it. But what we determined is that it's probably cost effective if you have productive genotypes, but it's not cost effective if you don't have productive genotypes. So as with everything, it boils down to better hazelnut germplasm.
All right, I'm going to have to move us on. You all should know, though, that there are a couple more questions you can answer in the, you can type an answer in, and also you can go to the answered question tab and add any additional comments or answers to questions that have already been answered on that tab. So feel free to please go through and do that. And I will move us on. Next up, we will have a little bit about processing hazelnuts from Paul Ronsheim from the American Hazelnut Company and Jason Fischbach from University of Wisconsin Extension, who we all know. All right, take it away, guys. And Paul, you are muted. You can unmute yourself if you like. There you go.
Do you see that? Can you see my page?
We cannot see your page. If you go down the green button, it's the share screen button. Go ahead and click that and see what happens. Yep, there we go. Something's starting up here.
I didn't launch here. There we go. Is that better?
There you go. Yep, it's working.
My Wi-Fi is a little slow. Okay. Good morning. I'm Paul Ronsheim. I'm a hazelnut grower near Madison. And I'm going to talk about my involvement with the American Hazelnut Company in terms of producing our products. So to set a little background, I started planting hazelnuts 8 or 9 years ago, seedlings. And I tried to set it up as a prototype production farm, but tiny, 6 acres, but with a 12 and 18-foot spacing and 30-foot headland, which is not enough. But the idea was to develop something that could be used to work on harvest equipment, or I planted 4,000 seedlings, perhaps find a good genotype. I don't think we found one in the 4,000. But nonetheless, the other thing is this is an eroded hilltop. So the soil thickness ranges from less than 12 to 20 inches. So I was interested in seeing whether a tree crop could survive, could establish itself, really. And this photo is in one of the sloped areas where the soil is very thin. And the trees are limited to about 8-foot height, whereas other places of the orchard, they're 12 and 14. So it does limit the growth potential to have very thin soil. But it's one of the ideas is to plant trees in this sort of agriculturally destroyed land and see if we can't make it productive. So this is great. I have an orchard. What am I going to do? It makes about 1,000 pounds a year. That's the potential of in-shell hazelnuts. So I need a partner now. I need to have a market for my product. So I joined up with American Hazelnut Company, knowing it would take a little sweat equity on my part to make this really happen. So I want to talk, so my role is running some of the production in Gay's Mills. So I'll go through our process there. So the Kickapoo Culinary Center, right on the banks of the Kickapoo River, is a certified kitchen. So there we collect the grower's harvest and sanitize it. We do the oil, flour, and roasted kernel production, including packaging, and the order fulfillment for the internet and retail. The in-shells are shipped to Northland College, where Jason has his Hazelnut Accelerator established, also a certified kitchen. And there, with his equipment innovations, he does the cracking, cleaning, and kernel sizing. So our flow is that we sanitize members' harvest in shells, transport to Ashland, we're a little inefficient in this regard for the cracking and cleaning. And then the clean kernel returns to the kitchen gaze mills where we do oil expelling. The press cake is milled to a flour, and it's 34% protein. And we roast the Midwest hazelnut kernel that's been cleaned up in Ashland. So I'll walk you through really the kitchen a little bit. This is a marvelous kitchen, 2,400 square feet. This is a shot of some of the growers' harvest, and you'll see a fair amount of husk material and some weevil damage. So this all needs to be sorted and cleaned out, but the first thing we do is sanitize it. And we just immerse it in the sink with a sanitizing solution and dry it on cookie sheets. We also do an incoming weighing step at this point. So these are sized Midwestern hazelnut kernel that Jason sent back to us. These are 9 millimeter. There's a fair number of splits in this selection, but I distribute them in a single layer on a cookie sheet, do a final inspection before roasting. So I have these convection ovens, we can load 50 pounds at a time. So this is roasting kernel for the flour making. We roast before we press. We have a large cooler, access to a large cooler for storage, keeping everything fresh. And exciting for us, we're installing a new oil expeller, a Kerncraft 2020. This shows it uninstalled. So we're replacing our previous capability with a really robust model. I think it's going to improve our throughput. Here it is running on its first trial. This is the press cake coming out the end, and the oil drips into this collection pan. And this press cake, we break up and then we grind in a flour mill. We can get very fine texture because the oil has been largely removed. So here I am packaging the roasted kernel. So we weigh out the bags of 16 ounces and put on our label, and we're ready to go. Our current products, as I think you've seen before this morning, we have hazelnut oil, the flour, and 2 sizes of roasted kernel, which people seem to be buying mostly for snacking. So we're really looking forward to the introduction of our flavored kernel, probably in just a few months. Okay, now I'll turn this over to Jason, and he can talk about the equipment advances in Ashland.
Okay, just a quick sound check. Everything looks good. Presentation's up. Okay, great. So I was going to talk about the hazelnut processing that we're doing in Ashland as part of our university-led hazelnut processing accelerator, which includes work not only in the post-harvest processing, but also the actual harvesting itself that we do in collaboration with the biological systems engineering crew, Dave Bonoff and Scott Sanford down at UW-Madison, and our grower partners. So a little history on this accelerator. This has been a project that really started in 2009, where we tried to bring growers together to start to envision a larger scale of hazelnut processing capacity. At the time, we had a number of enterprising growers that were cobbling together processing lines in their garages and using pretty innovative tools and equipment, but really slow. You know, at any volume, it's just not going to work. All subsidized labor. You know, they weren't paying themselves anything, and it was creating challenges. And so the goal was to bring together a processing steering committee and identify pieces of equipment that would be good for the scale that growers were at and where they wanted to be at, and also, was affordable. And I don't know if you know this, but if you get people together in a room and try to convince them to spend money together, it's actually kind of hard. And we couldn't pull it off, right? Because there's just too many strong opinions about how big the equipment should be, what scale are we looking for, and in terms of, where it should be located and all these things. It's just too hard to get growers to work together on this as sort of on their own. Now, what did come out of that was the American Hazelnut Company, and has really focused on the kernel to value-added product and marketing side, and has been doing good work there. And what we decided to do is, well, let's, first of all, this equipment that we're talking about for post-harvest processing is really expensive. And in Wisconsin, if you crack one nut and sell that kernel, it has to be done under a food processing plant license, and the facility that you use has to meet commercial food code. Now, in Wisconsin, I believe, or Minnesota, and I believe Iowa, there's cottage food laws that allow unlicensed processing at a smaller scale that allows you to sell at specific outlets. But regardless, even in those states, if we get to any sort of size, we're going to run into these processing regulations, and that means equipment that is stainless steel, meets all of the food code requirements. And when we start talking that, we're talking about expensive equipment. So what we did is let's put this in the public space. In other words, let's try to subsidize this initial processing, because if we had
about whether fabric or steaks are biodegradable?
Lois, I think you need to mute. So we said if we had an existing nut industry in there, you could just utilize co-packers and co-processors, but we don't have a nut industry in the upper Midwest, so we didn't have any processing capacity to lean on, so we had to build our own. And so we felt that from a public position, from the university perspective, this would be a great project to try to subsidize, to build a pilot facility, do some of this R&D and early exploration work, and then actually subsidize a processing facility as a bridge to a point where the private sector, the growers themselves, can do this on their own. And that's one reason why we're in Ashland. That's probably the least convenient place to put a processing facility, as far northern Wisconsin. But that's where we had a facility that we could use. And that's where, quite frankly, I'm located. That's where I live. And that's the person that right now on the public side is willing to put in the time and has the funding to do so. So we're making it work. But the full intention is to eventually move this equipment itself, or growers can copy this equipment in locations that make more sense. So anyway, we have a lot of partners on board. And that's kind of our model, is this is a public-private partnership, and we're all kind of working together toward the same means, but instead of it being a private entity, this is publicly subsidized. Okay, again, this is part of our larger accelerator, and what we do with this facility and this work is try to identify and evaluate all the different technologies that are out there to try to find the best technology, if you will, based on some of the research that we do. Because there's a lot of options. There's as many hazelnut crackers as there are mouse traps. Which is the best one and which is optimized for Midwest grown hazelnuts is something that we've been trying to answer. We also wanted to, again, provide an incubator where folks could bring their hazelnuts, get them processed under the food processing license, and be able to sell them without having to build their own commercial food code facility, without having to have the license, and without having to buy all this stainless equipment and infrastructure. And then we do outreach education. So we do field days and other events or trainings through and as production goes up, we anticipate that outreach education will be more important, especially as growers consider taking on some of this on their own. Okay, so there's, as you know, there are different aspects to hazelnut post-harvest processing. And for the most part, we are following the Turkish model, where we're harvesting in husk hazelnuts. The germplasm that we have doesn't drop free until you let them really dry down in the plant. By that time, the blue jays have stolen them all. And we also don't really want to harvest off the orchard floor. So we're picking them direct from the plant, which means we have this dehusking step that they don't have to this extent, say in Oregon or other regions. And it involves at this point some form of drying. Here's at Paul's place where he's got it laid out there, and he can move air and control temperature and get these dried down pretty rapidly. And then at that point, there are other a number of different husking technologies that are out there to remove that husk from the nut and separate the ground up husk from the nut. So the barrel husker up in the corner, there might be 5 or 6 of these in existence now. That again, those, this was a great thing that came out of the garage processors that came up with this design. A lot of people have copied it. It's still what we use for our research plantings. This is the new Hazelnut that was imported from Turkey, and the hope here is that we see more of these units out there because they are relatively inexpensive and seem to work well. And then there are some other models. Here's one that Pendragon Fabrications has built that's being used and has proven to work well in green husking. So as Dave Bonoff talked about, what we're hoping to do is incorporate this process into the field harvester. And so we actually have a true combine out there, and when what comes out of the field is nothing but in-shell nuts. But you've got this husking step. Our accelerator has not really, we kind of made a decision to let the growers still figure this out on their own, and for the most part they are. And instead our accelerator will focus on the harvesting components and then also the post-harvest, the cracking and cleaning side of the processing. So we are at the Northland College Food Center in Ashland, Wisconsin. This is a shared use kitchen facility, much like the Gaze Mills facility that Paul showed. I don't have any inside pictures, but everything meets food code, stainless steel everywhere. Triple wash sinks, hand washing stations, bathrooms, non-breakable lights, all the annoying plumbing, floor drains that make it really hard to do this kind of stuff on your own farm, because you can't do it in your kitchen and you'd have to build your own facility. And then that means plumbing, electricity, and drains. And that's why it's so hard. But anyway, so we use facilities like this. Here's Paul making a delivery this last year, and the nuts come to us in all shapes and forms of bins. Here are some totes, 5-gallon buckets. We've had them come in tote bags, tote bins, you name it. This is actually shell packed up and heading to Illinois for a project with biochar. I will say that, 30% is roughly kernel. We grow more shell than we grow kernel, and we really could, to help the economics, is figure out a high value use for shells. We don't really have one yet, but we're trying to figure that out. So anyway, they come to us in shell. That's what we require. We don't do any husking for folks officially. If you talk nice to me, usually I'll help you out if need be, but generally they come to us, and the American Hazelnut Company requires them, their members, if they're being sold through the American Hazelnut Company, to be delivered in shell without husk on it. But this facility is open to everyone, not just the American Hazelnut Company. So we do have some folks that use it that bring in nuts as well. Again, I showed this. So we've run through this picture previously today, but we've run about 10,000 pounds total in shell through the facility so far. It gives you some sense of just how small our industry is right now. And I would tell you, I mean, we need more nuts. That's the bottom line, right? So start growing more plants and shipping more nuts, because we can handle them now without problem. So this is our current equipment. In 6 months, we might have a different lineup. As soon as you start building a hazelnut processing facility, you realize as soon as you upgrade one piece of equipment, now the rest of it is obsolete. And so it's a continuous process of upgrading. And as the volume of nuts increases, then we need better and more equipment, right? It's a never-ending process. The other part of this too is we would like to drive out as much labor cost as possible in processing. Now that sounds bad, right? We don't want to put people out of work, but it's not exactly glamorous work involved here in this, where it's that hand sort step where you're just sitting there day after day, picking out the last little bit of kernel, or shell from the kernel. So we try to automate this and mechanize it as much as we can. And it's just a reality. You have to drive out that labor cost in order to be cost competitive. So just show some of this. I'm going to show this as a video. You won't be able to hear anything, so I'll try to narrate over the top. But when they come in, they're sized with this drum sizer first, so that we can separate that to get ready for cracking. And we're sorting for now on the minimum dimension. And this will move the product through a couple hundred pounds an hour. Then this is our new cracker from Burrell from Spain that's well optimized. And it's nice because it does a size separation at the same time. Then we use air to pull off the first cut of the shell fragments. Pretty simple process, super loud. And then we use a drum sizer to separate into size classes. And the advantage of this machine here is that we are using removable screens on the drum that we can then optimize those screens to the material that we are sizing. So it allows us to, in a limited space, have a lot more capacity than having one of these for each size class. But eventually you just add more of these units. Okay, so one of the key components for our sizing, and this is pretty well-known technology, it's used everywhere in Oregon, are these curved slots. And if you think about a round kernel, if it's big enough, it can't fit through here. But if you look at a shell fragment, it's curved. And so the shell fragment will wrap around this curve and fall through. So it's a really effective tool to separate the shell fragments from the kernels, the whole kernels, the shell fragments that don't get pulled off by the aspirator, because the aspirator is, based on the density and the surface area. And sometimes those shell fragments are roughly the same density and size as the kernels. And so they don't separate in the air column. So we use this mechanical separation. So with those drum sizers, if you imagine the kernels coming in on the front end, they're passing across those curved slots to pull off shell fragment. And then you're left with the kernels or uncracked nuts. And so what we're looking for, each of these is an outflow or a bin beneath that drum sizer, right? So these are the different curved slots, and these are the round holes. And what we're looking for are single bins that's nothing but kernel. That's the gold standard, because that means we don't have to do any hand sorting, which is, 70–80% of the labor cost in hazelnut processing is that final hand sort to get that last little bit of kernel out. So you can see we're getting pretty close. The blue would be split kernel, and the gray would be that dreaded shell that we're trying to get out. So this is a huge improvement, right? If you look at this photo, I mean, this is 10 years in the making. Now, if you're from Oregon and you look at this, you just kind of laugh, because it's like, well, we've been doing this forever. You just dump them in the front end, they come out the back end. Well, recognize we don't have any of this, and we're so small that it's not like we can just go order a $3 million hazelnut processing facility and have it installed, right? So we have to sort of design all this equipment based on the budgets that we have and the investments that it makes sense to make. So the time that it's spent to finally get to an appropriate scale where we can literally dump it in one end and out comes pure kernel, it's pretty amazing. Now, this isn't pure kernel. There's still a couple of shell fragments. But the point is, we can get to this step now with basically no labor involved. Right now we're moving equipment from one piece of equipment to another with 5-gallon buckets, but that's easy to replace. We just hook them up with conveyance equipment. The important part is that we're using machines, not human hands, to get to this point. So this is exciting. It's not perfect. We still have a ways to go, but we're getting there. And then, as Paul said, you've got kernel that you all can work your magic. That's the hope, is that you guys don't have to worry about the in-shell, the kernel processing. Let us worry about that. And then you guys work your magic with the actual kernels. So let me just give you some processing stats in terms of our goal is to get this as cheap as possible for people. But as of February 2022 or 2020, so our whole kernel recovery rate, this is important because once you split a kernel, it becomes less valuable. And it also is much, much harder and expensive to separate from shell fragments because they have the same size and shape and density. So our current pre-sizing combined with the cracking step with that cracker, we're around 82 to 93% whole kernel recovery rate, which is good and compares well to the industry. Now it varies a little bit on size. We would love to have more air space between the kernel and the shell, give us a little more room when we're doing this compression cracking. But that's pretty good. We can get clean kernel per hour of labor, about 14 pounds of kernel per hour, which you might look at that and just kind of, that's not very high, right? But remember, this is pounds of kernel. So, triple that, and that's your flow through rate of pounds of in-shell per hour. Obviously,
hey, I got to interrupt you here for a second. I got about 5 minutes left and a couple questions too.
Okay, yeah, I'm just wrapping it up here. Last slide. But 14 pounds per hour. And obviously, as the scale of production goes up, this number needs to go up. But again, we're at still, that 75% of that labor cost is hand sorting, that final step. Our slowest current equipment is the aspirator, about 200 pounds an hour. That's our bottleneck. We upgraded the cracker and the post-harvest or aspirating drum sizer, and now that aspirator is too slow. We can recover, so if it's about 35% kernel on average of the current genetics, we can recover 27.3% is kernel. Now we've got left over the split and shell mix that are identical sizes and shapes that's sort of a co-product we're not quite sure what to do with yet because we don't have the equipment to separate it. So that brings our labor cost to about $1 a pound for kernel. On top of that is the facility cost, because we pay rent to use that facility, and that, the more people involved, the cheaper that gets, but that's another 50 cents per pound. The equipment cost, don't ask. That's our problem, right? I mean, we've paid a lot of money for the crackers and designing and building that equipment. But obviously when the industry gets to scale and can afford it, then that becomes important. But for now, that's not included in the cost. That's the public sector's contribution. So if you look at the kernel equivalent cost, because again, when you pay $1.55 per pound in shell, you're not getting pure kernel, you're getting a mix of shell and air and whatever else it's in there. And so it works out to about $7.33 per pound is the current production cost if you're paying $1.55 a pound per in shell. That's the production cost just to get, that $1.55 in theory is paying the cost plus profit for the grower. And then we have to add the processing cost on top of that. So that's before any retail margins or anything else. Okay, what's needed next? Last slide for those of you that would like to get involved and help out. A, we need more nuts. Bring them on. Second, we need to continue to improve the dehusking to get that cheaper and easier for growers. And this is a color sorter. Brad Niemczyk brought this to our attention. We would love a couple $100,000 for this to separate out the last of the split kernels from the shell. It would make zero economic sense given the scale that we're at. But this is the kind of equipment that eventually will be needed to recover those split kernels. And we still need, as Paul showed, the dipping of bins into a sink to sanitize, not acceptable. We all know that. And so we're looking for equipment to do this automatically, basically dump the in shells in, surface sanitize them, and then go into storage. Okay, so I got time for Paul and I for a few questions, I think.
All right, so what, if any, grant programs were you able to use to purchase the equipment?
So we've had private donations, contributions from growers. We have worked with the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. Turns out they don't just fund Foxconn, forget, but they also fund other startups around and other industries to support them. So they've provided some funding support. Some of our time is supported by the USDA. Initially, there was the Buy Local, Buy Wisconsin grant program, helped get the American Hazelnut Company started. So there are certainly programs that are available to help subsidize some of these barriers to entry.
All right. Are UW engineering students helping in inventing and designing the needed machines?
They are. They were involved very much so when Dave was still teaching. He's since retired, but their student design courses have provided some baseline engineering, and actually that drum sizer that I showed that we're using for sizing on the front end was initially designed. Now it's improved a bit by Dave, but that came from a student design project. So yeah, it's important to, and we're hoping to continue to work with students and others, because like I said, this is, all hands on deck to try to help get this going.
All right. How well does the Hazelnut sand harvester clean the husks from the nuts for you, or do you still end up using a dehusking step after using the vacuum harvester?
My personal experience with that is not too extensive. The owner of it, I think, as we've talked a lot about it. And so there's sort of two components to how effective it is. One, remember that thing is sized for the European hazelnuts. So there's definitely some screen adjustments that can be made to improve it to accommodate the smaller nuts that we have. It depends on the moisture content of the husk when it comes in. So the drier, the more effective it is. The bigger driver, though, is simply the maturity of the nuts. If you pick those before they're mature and they haven't upsized, I don't care what dehusker you're using, you're not going to get it all off. And so it really depends on how mature those nuts are when they come in. But I guess if others wanted to comment. Our hope here is we get more use and experience with it, that we can really dial it in and optimize its use.
All right, and finally, what about weevils in nuts?
Yeah, so when we get them, we rarely ever see a weevil itself, the larva. What we see are the exit holes. And it's really, we do a grading process. And so we will, take a subsample and count the number with Weevil nuts or Weevil nuts. And then the American Hazelnut Company has their payment protocols. So they don't pay for blanks, whether they're caused by weevils or something else. Now, like I said, our weevil damage that we've seen of nuts coming into the facility have typically been under 5%. It has not been a big problem yet. Those 20% damage numbers in Rosemont, it's the highest I've ever seen or heard of yet in our planting. We've looked at lots and lots of different plantings and nuts. So it's an issue we're aware of, and we're going to have to pay attention to it. But so far, it hasn't been too bad.
All right, so it's a minute after 11. I want everyone to know that there's a break time. You will be starting back up at 11:10, so that's just 9 minutes. But Jason, if you've got a minute extra too, while some are taking a break, there's another question that came in. Can you give people advice on how to tell when their nuts are ready to harvest and when they are fully ripe?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's hard to follow this advice when you see blue jays and everything else stealing nuts, but picking them when they're not ripe really isn't an option because they don't dehusk and typically the nuts will shrivel. Now, is there a grace period where you could pick like 3 days or 4 days early and then they'll finish ripening in the greenhouse? Yes, there is a publication on our website that goes through this, but it's not like you can pick 2 weeks in advance and let them ripen in the greenhouse. It doesn't work that way. So the way you tell is you've got to go out there and check, and you've got to wiggle the nuts that are in the husk. And if they're loose, then they can be picked. And what the problem that we're finding is some growers will go out and with these seedlings, they'll find a couple of shrubs that are ripe, and then they'll pick everything in the orchard. And the problem is, half of those plants might not be ripe yet because they're seedlings, they mature at different times. So you literally have to, in middle of August, start assessing maturity of those nuts. And you're going to, as you learn your planting, you'll know which individual plants mature before others, and then you'll start picking. So this isn't a picking process that happens on a weekend. This is a picking process that happens over a month, at least, if you're trying to keep up with maturity. Now, it's interesting, at least my observations, and I think others would affirm this, is that the animals know where the ripe ones are too. And so if you're staying ahead on the ripening and picking as they ripen, you can minimize a lot of the predation. The blue jays are always going to steal some, but if you wait till everything's ripe, you can't do that either because you've got so many that were ripe, 3 weeks ago, and then they've just been eaten. So that's check if it's loose in the husk, and if it's loose, pick that plant. You'll note the south side typically ripens before the north side, the shaded side. So you might be picking half a shrub, on Monday and the other half on Friday. So it's really that's the challenge we've got right now with the seedling materials. There's just so much variation in that maturity.
All right, thanks everybody. We've got about 6 minutes. Everybody should get up and stretch your legs, go get more coffee. Come meet back here at 11:10, and we will get back started up again with Linda Meschke talking about USDA programs that might be available for us. All right, see you soon. Okay, hello everybody, welcome back. Linda Meschke, who runs Rural Advantage, a nonprofit in southern Minnesota looking to figure out how to help farmers adapt third crops. We'll be talking about USDA programs for hazelnut growers. Linda, are you there? And are you able to, your screen does look shared, so you should be ready to go.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Yeah, I'm serve on the Minnesota USDA NRCS State Technical Committee, and also have worked with the NRCS on several projects over the years. I also serve on the Martin County SWCD Board of Supervisors, so have quite a bit of experience with some of these NRCS programs. Today, I thought it would be most useful, rather than get into just naming a bunch of practices that people can apply, is to give you information so you can go in and apply for these programs and be successful. Working with the federal government is a little bit complicated at times, and so I hope this will help you. The PowerPoint will be available on the MidwestHazelnuts.org website when all the conference things are posted. If you feel you need this information, a copy of the slides ahead of time, just email me and I can send you a copy of the slides. So here we go. So take notes. Or, whoops, I'm not going forward. Why is that? All right. So when we talk about USDA programs, we're really talking about the Farm Bill, and the legal title is the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018. And each farm bill at the federal level is on a 5-year cycle. So in 2023, there will be a new farm bill, and that will be driving the direction of conservation on the land at that point. So the 2018 Farm Bill has a $1.8 billion budget. The programs from the Farm Bill are voluntary, but being voluntary, they have certain rules you have to follow to get their money. That's like with any grant program or any other programs you enroll in, you have to follow the guidelines, and that's very important. On the right-hand side of the screen is the different sections are what they call titles within the Farm Bill. So we have a commodity title, conservation title, et cetera, on down the list. The nutrition title is the over half of the funding of the Farm Bill. So that's the biggest component overall. And today we're focused on the conservation title, and 2 agencies under USDA, the Farm Service Agency and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And then specifically, I'm going to address my comments to the EQIP program, Environmental Quality Incentive Program. So this is a great program that hazelnut producers and others can utilize to get conservation on their land. So what is EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program? And if you haven't noticed already, the government has lots of acronyms. And so over time, you'll get familiar with these, but hopefully I won't get too overwhelming with acronyms today. But anyway, so what is EQIP? EQIP supports producers interested in conserving and improving natural resources on their farms and ranches. Participants install or implement structural, vegetative, and/or management practices. So management practice might be like fertilizer or manure application on your land. Tillage, like residue management. Those are examples of management practices. They provide cost share or a payment rate for each practice that you decide to apply. In Minnesota, they mostly have gone to payment rates rather than a straight cost share. So it used to be like 75% of the project was cost shared, by the federal government, and then the landowner paid 25%. Or maybe it was 50-50. Okay, so that varies with each practice, and you just need to understand what it is when you sign up. Socially disadvantaged, limited resource, beginning and veteran farmers may be eligible for a higher rate. So like cost share, instead of 75%, if you fit one of these categories, you could get 90% cost shared. And then you just have to pay 10%. Or the payment rate would be higher, significantly higher for people in those categories. And you should just be aware of those. You may or may not fit into any of those categories, but they are available. And then at the, there's special initiatives at the national, state, or even the local levels within the EQIP program. So on the right side there, to be eligible, and this is the important piece, to be eligible, an applicant must be the owner or operator of eligible land engaged in agriculture, forestry, or livestock. So you either need to be the owner or operate it and have an agreement with the owner for the life of the project, or the terms of the contract of the project, I should say, not the life of the project. So for EQIP, it might be 2 or 3 years length of time in the contract. Some things might be a 10-year agreement. But it depends on the practice. At the national level, 50% or more of the EQIP funds must go towards livestock operations. Now, we're not talking about livestock here today, but just know of the funding pool of money, half of it goes to livestock. So it just cuts in half the money that's available, so to speak. In theory, on the average, it needs to be 50% across the nation. So some states are more livestock orientated than others, and so it all averages out. The program is competitive, so it's not you go in and you automatically get funded. They look at cost effectiveness of whatever you want to do, effectively and comprehensively address the resource concerns on your farm, and does it improve existing conservation practices already in place? So they're looking for those things as they review your project. So here's a list of common EQIP conservation practices. And I'm not going to read all these, but these are ones that are probably most applicable to hazelnut production. Now notice it does not say commercial hazelnut production as any of these practices. Okay, and I'll address that a little more. In Minnesota, the list of practices is 38 pages long, and there's 25 practices listed on each page. That's how many practices are available just in Minnesota. Okay, so each state probably has a similar amount available. So this is just a small number of the practices. And then when you do these practices, they sometimes have different scenarios where you can, like a critical area planting, maybe you have to, remove a few trees before you can do it, or get rid of invasive weeds or something like that. And so there might be 2 or 3 components under that practice that you also could get funding for. So it all depends on which practice you're looking at, and your district conservationist will help work through that and help share what's available. So with EQIP, and this, if you don't go away with anything else today for this slideshow, understand this. For EQIP, you must address a resource concern, and that's either soil, water, air, plants, animals, or energy. Okay, commercial hazelnut production is not a resource concern. And so you can't go into NRCS office and say, I want some money to plant hazelnuts, to get a hazelnut planting going. Okay, they're not going to fund that. What you have to say is, I've got a water erosion problem on my farm and I want to plant some hazelnuts to provide protection for that land. Okay, you have to think about it in this context and think about how you might sell hazelnuts as a conservation practice for your site. So I've listed here a few things, and there are more, a few things that you could say. It reduces soil erosion. It improves water quality. That's a big, big one in today's priorities. It captures CO2, and it sequesters carbon. It increases landscape diversity, improves wildlife and pollinator habitat, and reduces on-farm fuel usage. So less passes over the field if you got a perennial versus an annual crop. You're not using all that fuel to work the ground. So these are just a few examples. On the bottom there, the National Resource Concern List and planting criteria. This is I forget, a 26-page document, I think it is, but it lists these resource concerns and then it lists subcategories and sub things of different things you can do and think about. So if you go to the USDA website and you look this up, you can help yourself get a better understanding of what these resource concerns are and how NRCS looks at them and how you might be able to better sell your project so that they'll want to fund it under EQIP. Okay, so let's sort through the weeds here a little bit. So who do I contact about EQIP? Well, you want to talk to your NRCS district conservationist, it's called. So people get a little confused, understandably, between the FSA, the NRCS, and the SWCD. So I've tried to spell them out here a little bit so that you can get a better picture. FSA and NRCS are the federal levels of conservation. SWCD is the state or local level of conservation. They run different programs, but they do work together. They're sisters in conservation, you might say. So let's start with FSA, because that's your first step in this whole process. FSA, Farm Service Agency, there's an office in every county in the United States. Now, with budget cuts, a few counties have consolidated and there's maybe 2 counties together. Okay, but basically think of it as an office in every county. They provide financial assistance, and they're the administrators of conservation programs through USDA at the county level. This is where you sign up to get your farm eligible for Farm Bill programs. Okay, if you haven't signed up and gotten your farm eligible, you can't enroll in any of the programs USDA offers. Okay, you do not need a crop production history for your farm. Now that's important too. So I live in South Central Minnesota. We're the land of corn and soybeans, and everybody's got corn and soybean tunnel vision. And so when we think about hazelnuts, you know, they're kind of lost because they only understand corn and soybeans. So there's some education that maybe needs to occur, but about 99% of the farmers in Martin County, where I live, are enrolled in the farm program for the commodity crop portion. So when I talk about crop history, that means crop history of commodity crops, which in my case here is corn and soybeans. So not needing to have that crop production history is important. So if you go into your FSA office, what you want to ask them is tell them you want to establish a farm identification for FSA. That's just a number for your farm within the government records. Okay. And then for the parcel of land you have, you want to establish a track number, it's called. And that tracks that field. So if you just have like 10 acres, you know, they'll probably give you one tract number. If you have 120 acre farm, maybe 3 different parcels, each parcel will probably have a separate tract number, especially if they're in different sections. Okay, hopefully you know what a section is.
So Linda, you got about 5 minutes left here.
Okay, so establish that tract number and determine your eligibility. And well, USDA will determine your eligibility to make sure you're in compliance with Swamp Buster and Sod Buster. If you're looking for their phone number, it's under US government, not under FSA. NRCS is the office in the county. There's an office in every county. It's a sister agency to FSA, and they provide the technical assistance. This is the office you'll be working with to sign up for EQIP or any other conservation programs. For EQIP, you have to sign up during enrollment periods, but you need to go in and talk to them ahead of time and develop your plan, develop whatever ideas or plans you have. And then you'll need to sign a contract with USDA if you go forward with the project. And all funding is on a reimbursement basis. So you pay the bill and then they'll reimburse you when you submit receipts. The SWCDs, that's the state or local level. There's a county in there, there's an office in every county. They provide both financial and technical assistance of state and local funds. And they work collaboratively with FSA and NRCS. So in the big picture, the USDA has this programs, the EQIP program we're talking about today for the whole nation, okay? Then Minnesota has their program, which has to be within the framework of that national offerings for Minnesota. For example, like Minnesota doesn't have programs for like rice and cotton because it's not in our area, okay? Each state is different in what they offer at the state level. So if you're in Wisconsin, you have different offerings than Minnesota has. Many of them are the same or similar, but there are differences. And then within the county will have offerings under what the state offers for that county. So in Martin County, we have corn and soybean type practices. We don't have forestry practices so much. Those are more in Northeast Minnesota. So just be aware there's different offerings in every county and every state. So here's some example EQIP practices. I've just picked a few states and some practices. You can see a lot of them are similar and some of them are not as common or available. You can advocate for adding practices to your state or your county. So just be aware of that. Jason has developed a fact sheet that I don't think is available to the public yet, but his is for Wisconsin, and then the other grower cluster groups are developing for each state across the Midwest, but helping to describe this EQIP process and how it applies to hazelnuts. And then just some simple steps to successful EQIP. Develop your ideas, think about what you'd like to accomplish, talk about to yourself how those would meet those resource concerns, identify who your local people are in the NRCS office and arrange to meet with them. With COVID, these might be over the phone meetings, but also they do come out to your site. And then go, if you think you're going to proceed, go to the FSA and sign up your farm so it's eligible. And then you should discuss your plans with the conservationist to see how it's applicable to your site, what ideas they have, how you might enhance that. And then you need to do whatever preparation work is required You sign up for the practices. Generally, there's a time frame between when you sign up and when you might get the funds, or excuse me, be approved for the funds. And that time frame, like right now, you might sign up and you won't be able to do the project till the spring of 2022. So pay attention to the sign up periods and get your materials in on time, and then wait till you're approved. You get permission to go forward with your projects, meaning it has been approved.
All right, Linda, we're out of time here. So if you
Okay.
have maybe one last,
Yep, this is
Any
my
last-
last slide. So
okay.
I just want to point out local work groups. They're going to be meeting here now over the next 6 months, probably. Each county has a local work group. And this is where decisions are made at the local level. And then they go up the chain all the way to the national level through NRCS. And so this is where you can go and sit with the conservation leaders in your county and advocate for hazelnut or other conservation practices, you know, like woody perennials, other woody perennials, and grass perennials, other things, and get them on the approved project list in your county. And then that moves up to the region and then to the state and then on to the national, if there's enough interest. So it's important that all of us hazelnut growers get involved in these processes and advocate for the types of crops we want to plant. And that's my last slide. I got just a end slide here, but that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Linda. We're crunched for time, so if anybody has questions, please do type them into the Q&A box. We will answer them through text responses, so we'll make sure all of the questions do get answered, even if we don't do them on vocally here. So next up, we have Jason Fischbach again talking about hazelnut enterprise budgets to help us all understand how much money we will or won't be making and how a little bit how this business works. So take it over again. Thank you, Jason. And Jason, if you're talking, you're on mute.
You'd think I'd have this figured out by now. But so mainly what I'm going to talk about here is to introduce you to 3 tools that you can all use as you start to evaluate the economics of your hazelnut adventures, because there's no way I could give you an answer of how much money you're going to make growing hazelnuts, because there are so many variables involved. And so really what we try to do at the University or Extension is instead to provide you with tools that you can use to understand, say, the line items on your enterprise budget, and then start to fill out your own numbers, which ultimately is what you're going to need to do to evaluate a production system that you're considering. So I always like to start with, well, what exactly is your hazelnut enterprise? You know, I think Mark Shepard did a good job pointing out that there is more to growing hazelnuts, or can be more to growing hazelnuts than just growing hazelnuts. And so you need to define what your enterprise is. And then I think also measure the success. How do you measure it, right? Because there's a lot of different reasons why people are growing hazelnuts. And we have to be cognizant of those reasons as we sort of talk about enterprise budgeting or why people grow hazelnuts. Try this again. So here's, you know, maybe the easiest and most typical way that hazelnuts are grown in the upper Midwest right now. This is our hedgerow system that we envision, very much an orchard-based model with what you would call sod culture. So it's mowed lawn, turf grass, essentially between the rows. And everything that's done here is to try to optimize the growth and production of the hazelnuts. Other revenues from that parcel of land aren't necessarily a priority. Now, there might be situations in which you would grow other things specifically to enhance the production of the hazelnuts. And maybe we'll get to that point with understanding pest cycles and other plants that can promote beneficial insects, right? And start to be more strategic about what kind of diversity is in these plantings. But the concept anyway here is, are you trying to just grow hazelnuts and that's your number one focus? Because that's how you'll evaluate success and that's how you'll build your enterprise budgets. You might also look at the alley cropping systems. This is actually a picture from Oregon. And I know we all like to show the picture of the dust clouds in the bare orchard floors, but that's not how all hazelnuts in Oregon are grown. In the Willamette Valley, there's a pretty established and big grass seed industry. And so you do see a fair amount of alley cropping. And so this is a concept that, of course, can be carried over to the upper Midwest because you're waiting 4 or 5 years for those hazelnuts to mature and start to produce nuts and start to produce revenue. And so you've got a lot of open ground. And depending on your spacing, you can be productive and try to make some money. So if nothing else, you should be thinking of ways to use this space to cover your establishment costs while you wait for the hazelnuts to mature. And we do this through alley cropping. Now that might mean you use a wider row spacing. You might even think of alley cropping through the life of the planting and not just in the early stages when you're waiting for the plants to eventually shade out the row middles. But I think this is something at a minimum we should be doing when growing hazelnuts in the upper Midwest, is thinking about alley cropping. Now there's also the other approach, right? And our agroforestry friends and those in permaculture are always pushing. And so we've got this multifunctional, multi-revenue, diversified perennial polyculture concept with animals. As an extension agent, I'm often a target of those in the permaculture world that like to use the word reductionist, right? So hopefully I've used enough multis and polys in here to make everybody happy. But you get the idea. The point is to plant multiple species of plants with multiple revenue sources to maximize productivity and profit potential from that acre of land, instead of just thinking a monoculture of hazelnuts. Of course, it's easier said than done, right? Here's the woody weeds eventually will diversify your hazelnut planting, whether you like it or not. But the concept is solid, I think, where you're trying to think not so much about how much money you're making from hazelnuts, but how much money or how much production you're getting out of an acre of land. And this niche-based utilization and diversity is something for sure we need to explore, but it's not often as simple as just plant a bunch of stuff in a row and then hope it works out, right? So, but the point is, you can look at using hazelnuts in different kinds of production systems. So what's your measure of success? Is it a fun hobby just to grow hazelnuts? Great. Is it a serious hobby so that you can use the word reductionism and be a perennial polyculturalist? Maybe, that's fine too. Is it farming for the public good, right? And where your focus, and this isn't necessarily for making money, but instead trying to sequester carbon, filter water. If you're a landowner for recreational purposes, this is the great crop to grow. There's so many public goods from it, and not only for the public, but for your own property, right? Is it being used as a complementary crop that isn't necessarily to make money itself, but is used to enhance the overall profitability of the farm? And maybe that's putting hazelnuts out there to provide a windbreak for your vegetable crops in the field that you're growing in the alleys, right? So maybe the hazelnuts don't necessarily have to even break even if they've got some other purposes that are monetized in the form of the other crop production. But ultimately, I think most people are interested in trying to make money growing hazelnuts, and that's where it would be good to know the potential revenues and the costs involved to produce those hazelnuts. So if you're trying to make money, if so, how much money? Are you just trying to develop a system that can have a little bit better returns than corn and soybeans? Are you trying to compete with high value fruit crops? What's the context by which you're evaluating your planting? Okay, so we have, whether you're growing these in super diversified plantings or you just want to be a hazelnut grower, you can use these tools to evaluate and build models for your system. So we have a hazelnut enterprise budget, which is designed just around the production and sale of hazelnuts. We have a hazelnut processing enterprise budget for those of you that at some point want to take on that processing challenge yourself of turning in-shell nuts into saleable kernels. And then we also, it's still in development. The other two are pretty solid. But the third one, this hazelnut harvesting enterprise budget. How much does it cost you to own and operate a hazelnut harvesting equipment? How many acres do you need to support a hazelnut harvesting unit? Those are the kinds of questions we're trying to answer for you. So I'm going to in and out of screen sharing here, so we'll see how this goes, but this is just an example, and this is downloadable on our website. It comes in 2 versions, one without macros, and macros are just some coding behind the scenes that allow you to navigate more readily. Some computers don't like macros because they think it's malicious code, so you can download the one without macros from the website. But I'm going to stop sharing and just flip through here. This is one of our original tools. So some of you have probably seen this, but the idea here is that you can go step by step and plug in your numbers for each of these yellow boxes, and then all the other numbers will automatically update. So you can figure out what your target planting is, row spacing, plant spacing, the number of rows, the length of row. It's then going to calculate the number of acres that you're planting. You plug in your plant source. So this might be, 1.0 hazelnut seedlings, and maybe it's Rose 9.2 cultivars, the cost of each plant, number of plants, and that's going to give you your plant costs. So you work through this for your land costs, your tree tube costs, your drip irrigation. Then you can start to enter in your labor components, and this would be for tillage, for site prep, any labor with weed control. You just continue on down through the tool, and at the back end, you're going to have an enterprise budget that lays out your establishment year costs, your pre-production year costs, your early production years. And then we used this year 8, we included this for the seedling growers that what's recommended is you start out with a fairly high plant density, and then you rogue out the poor performing seedlings and replace them with higher producing, maybe layers from your highest producing plants. And so there's a renovation year with some higher costs there to account for that.
Hey,
And you can
Jason,
start-
I gotta interrupt you for a second. Your screen sharing has disappeared. So if you're able to try that again, that'd help.
Sorry about that. You all missed the fun and games, I think. So anyway, the point is that this tool allows you to enter your input costs for each of the steps in Hazelnut production, and it'll kick out an enterprise budget for you that you can use to evaluate the feasibility for your own situation. And it'll even make a nice graph to show when your break-even point might be. Okay, so that's the Hazelnut enterprise budget around production. And now I'm going to go back to the slides here, and hopefully this works. I want to show some real life numbers though, again, because what are you building an enterprise budget for? Are you basing it on existing numbers, or are you basing it on projected numbers of improved germplasm? And again, it's sort of this time lag that we have inherent in hazelnut. So I wanted you to show you some real life numbers of existing seedling orchards, because we have growers now that are doing a really good job with their production and trying to optimize hazelnut production. They're using mechanical harvesting equipment. And so we're close to having a kind of a real life model of what we envision for hedgerow hazelnuts using the seedling populations that are available right now. And so we've quantified these in-shell yields off the plantings, and then you look at on per acre basis. Now note, we've got in-shell yields around 200 to 700 pounds per acre. On our new germplasm, again, that we've still only have at plot scale, we're projecting in-shell yields of closer to 2,500 to 3,000. And that's what the enterprise budgets are based off. But if in real life numbers off these seedlings that are so variable, our per acre yields are pretty low, okay? So if you start to spin that out in terms of the returns, $1.55 a pound, that's some decent revenue even off the total, but the per acre returns are pretty low, especially, so we looked at 2 different scenarios. One, a hand picking cost based at 13 pounds of in-shell per hour. There will be those that claim that they can do it a lot faster. I like to think our numbers are pretty solid because we've based it on all of our different picking trials. All of our field techs, we time them. And so we have a pretty good average of what you can do. 13 pounds in-shell per hour. At $15 an hour is just an exorbitant cost, right? So that's why we look at mechanical harvesting, which is not cheap either because you've got expensive equipment. And so you can start to see returns per acre. Now this returns per acre is just covering the harvesting costs. It doesn't include, these returns would have to cover the establishment costs and all the other costs associated with production. So, which is why, despite the potential it's not as though we have thousands of acres of seedling origin hazelnut plants, because the numbers just are not working. I wish this wasn't the case. I wish the seedlings were adequate. Now, if you start to add in alley cropping revenues and agritourism and everything else, maybe the overall system works. But at this point, the plant material itself is just not working. If it was, my proof is that the farmers always have the right answers. And if this was working financially, we would see much, much bigger plantings by now. Okay, so these are existing numbers. But we have built out an enterprise budget that you can download. It tries to answer this question: can I make money growing hazelnuts? And you can download this from our website, and it is all based on the yields from our projected yields from improved germplasm that is coming out of the UMHDI program. Okay, so it'll take you line by line, and then you can look at those numbers and say, I can do that for cheaper, or why would you ever count that as a cost? I've owned that tractor for 30 years. I'm not going to expense my tractor time. Right, so you can do all those things to come up with your own enterprise budgets. So when we do this, it's exciting, right? So the orange numbers would be our projected net income before principal, interest, taxes, and interest or insurance, which is going to vary based on how much money you're borrowing for your. These all are specific to your enterprise. But if you look at the costs for the establishment, we control all those things, and then the yields from the nuts and the sales. The numbers in gray are from Oregon. These are based on, at scale production. And if you look at our projected numbers and costs, we're pretty close. Okay. And so we're looking at net annual income, between $2,000 and $3,000 a year, which is why we all get excited about hazelnuts and what this improved germplasm. That does not include any alley cropping revenue that you might do in the establishment years. Okay. So there's for sure some potential, but we all have to deal with the reverse J curve. And this is the other big bottleneck, especially if you start looking at net present value or opportunity costs. You're going to go in the red for a while until your nuts start to produce. And we're looking at break even somewhere 7 to 10 years, depending on, if this particular blue chart is using $1 per pound pay price to the grower for in-shell nuts. We'd love it to be $1.50, but that means the company that's paying that amount of money needs to be profitable with that ingredient cost, essentially. So hopefully they can do it. But anyway, so you got to just be aware that you're going to be putting a lot of money into the ground and hoping it grows and you start to see these nice returns. All right, so let me switch gears a bit and talk about the in-shell to kernel processing, and similar model where you can start to, and I'm going to try to do the screen share again here with this different model. Greg, can you see the screen now with
I can see the screen.
Okay.
No, I cannot.
Well, we're going to go back to that. That's okay. So you can go step by step again, quantify what you're working with, what's the % kernel of the material that's coming into your processing facility? What's it costing you if you are doing the husking and cleaning? What's it costing you to do the sanitizing? When you're cracking and then using air to separate it, you can enter in your equipment ownership and operation costs, your labor costs. You've got that final hand sorting step. So it breaks down each of these steps that you can start to enter into your own costing numbers, including your overhead, and then it'll kick out what your per pound kernel cost is to turn in-shell nuts into clean kernels. So I think it's a handy tool that those of you that want to take on this project can use. Okay, so I want to just reiterate, and Mike talked a little bit about this pricing challenge that we still face, right? So these are raw kernels that you can buy. I just used a supplier out in Oregon, but you certainly can buy these, Trader Joe's. You can buy them online on nuts.com, and the price is going to be these days it's somewhere between $10 and $15 a pound for raw whole kernels. Okay, so that's kind of the market that we're operating in if you're selling direct, if you will, to the customers, right? This is the retail price. So as a processor, if you buy in-shell hazelnuts for $1 a pound, how much are you paying per pound of kernels? So we just go through this process, right? And these are numbers that if you're a processor, you got to figure this out. So at best, right now with our current seedling genetics, we're at 35 to 40% kernel by weight. If you look at the advanced selections of European hazelnuts, we're 40 to 50, if not higher %. So we're already at a competitive disadvantage because of our lower percent kernel. Now the breeding work that's being done is trying to move that number up. However, I think it's going to be really interesting as we see this weevil data emerge, because we know weevils are endemic throughout our wild populations. And so we expect in our commercial hybrid plantings to have weevil pressure. And so if we find that kernel or shell thickness is actually a deterrent to weevil feeding and egg laying, we may not necessarily, there's going to be a trade-off we're going to have to evaluate whether it's worth to really push the envelope for thin shells if it's going to require some extent of weevil control. So we'll see where that goes. But anyway, you're dealing with some sort of kernel percent by weight to start with. That's your maximum that you're going to get out of those whole in shells. You're going to split some as you crack them, right? And whether you can recover that kernel or split or not depends whether you can buy a color sorter. And then there's always just some inherent kernel lost or totally smashed, non-recoverable, whatever. So the upper Midwest, we're at about 27.3% of the in-shells that come in is a captured kernel that we can sell. So if you run your numbers right out of the gate, yeah, you're paying $1 a pound for in-shell, but you're actually paying $3.67 per pound for kernel, right? And so now if you're looking at going up the value chain to compete with $13.50 a pound, you've got to put on top of that your processing cost. Plus, remember, this includes, there might be for sure the retail margin, there might also be a distributor margin in there as well. And so that's the challenge we've got on selling the in-shell, but at least this pricing tool can help you figure those numbers out. Okay, so now there's this harvester question. And Greg, how am I doing on time? Sorry, clock isn't.
We got about 9 minutes left, but questions too.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll wrap up soon here. So I'm just going to show a couple of videos. Hopefully it comes through of a couple harvesters in action. This is one of the old blueberry harvesters. It's a slapper type head on it, and relatively inexpensive if you can find them. It's going to take considerable maintenance to bring them up to functioning, and there's some modifications that we'll be recommending as we finish our work. But there's a harvester that you could buy and use. And then this one is the Oxbow unit that Dave talked about in action. It's an olive harvester. It was the original prototype. Much higher throughput capacity in terms of the cleaning and winnowing step, and it can go faster. It's got a little larger tunnel on it. Lots more bells and whistles for loading and offloading. So you can spend a whole lot more money on a piece of equipment like this. Dave didn't get a chance to show any of these videos, so I figured I would. Given the work involved and the sweating and swearing to get this thing functional so that we could try it last fall, it definitely has opened a lot of eyes. Not only in our upper Midwest, but across hazelnut growing regions in the world, there's been interest in, wait a second, maybe this over-the-top harvesting is something we should look at. So anyway, we have developed a tool here, what we call so far the Hazelnut Harvest 1.0, that you can use to start to pencil out numbers if you were going to buy one. So all these yellow boxes, you can enter your own numbers. So in this case, I'm more or less making up some of these numbers, but Hazelnut harvester around 20,000 for an old BEI unit. You're going to have to amortize that to get your annual ownership costs. What's your maintenance cost? Did you borrow money to buy it? So you've got that cost. You have to pay to store it. What's your transportation cost to get it to and from farms, if that's what you're doing? What's the fuel cost? All these are operating costs. And then there's the question of how many acres or how many pounds do you spread those ownership and operating costs across, right? Because that's going to determine your per unit cost to run these harvesters. Now, the work that we're doing in the fall here that we've done the last 2 years, we'll do another year, probably beyond, is trying to get you some real numbers in terms of how fast can these things operate? What efficiencies do you have in terms of if there's 1,000 pounds of hazelnuts hanging out there, what percent can you get versus what are actually dropped on the ground that it misses, that kind of thing. How much labor is involved to go with each of these units. So with real numbers, we can start to, another one, of course, would be if you've got 10 hours in a day and you're mechanical harvesting, how many hours are actually spent harvesting versus turning on headlands versus fixing breakdowns or whatever maintenance you have to do as you harvest, loading and unloading bins, that kind of thing. And so then you can start to use these numbers to say, okay, let's say I had 43 acres and I know these costs, then my per pound cost is 33 cents per pound in shell. Okay. So these are really important numbers for our industry to get to some sort of scale to understand what these harvesting costs are, because it's sort of our main bottleneck at this point. So this gives a tool for folks to start playing around. I realize when our audience, we only have a handful of these units in existence that are being used. So there's only so many people that would use this spreadsheet, but I do think if you're considering it, buying one, that you take a look at this tool. Okay, that's all I prepared. Again, these are available, and Connie put the link in the chat box where you can go and find these. The Hazelnut Harvester 1.0 is not up there yet, but it will be here by early next week. Just a couple of things to tweak on it. And you can certainly contact me if you've got any questions about it.
All right, throw your questions up in the Q&A box for Jason. Right now there's a comment here. Jason, could you give a shout out to Scott Sanford for his work in getting Big Blue up and running?
Oh, can I yell loud enough? I don't know. So just some context, we were able to get a $400,000 machine for like $10,000, but we had to dig it out of the opossum nests and the raccoons. I say we in quotes. I'm not sure I did anything but take a picture. It was Scott Sanford and Dave Bonoff who did all this work and got that thing up and running. I mean, it's amazing to have that asset now that we can use as a tool when we're evaluating our systems. And I see going forward that we can use this as a way to, at scale, evaluate our different pruning strategies, our row spacing strategies, all the different questions that we're going to have to answer around this hedgerow system. Big Blue gives us a great tool to be able to answer those questions. Not to mention, if we figure out sort of the logistics, we'd like that thing to be put to good use too, and harvesting hazelnuts for people. So yeah, it would not have happened without Scott Sanford and Dave making it happen.
All right. Also, how well can harvesters handle grade differences?
Yeah, if you mean by slopes, I think it's sort of the risk tolerance of the driver, but each of the legs or wheels are controlled hydraulically, so you can control the level of the machine. And so we're operating on slopes, and Dave might want to cut in here, but 15 to 20%. I think the main challenge is when you get sort of wet, slippery grass, when you're turning or trying to go up the hill, you got to make sure you have good traction. But it can handle some pretty significant slopes, maybe more than you're comfortable handling as the operator, but functionally they're designed to operate on some slopes.
Okay, we got a couple more minutes for other questions if they come in. Or is it correct in terms of slopes that they can run on?
He says Jason is correct in terms of the slopes they can run on. Thanks, Dave. Just to confirm.
How would Big Blue transport between properties?
Yes. So it's going to have to go on a flatbed. This isn't something you're going to just drive down the road unless it's really close. You obviously see big combines going from field to field. So that's one reason we want to see clusters of growers working together, so you don't have to put these on trailers. Big Blue in particular is a pain because it's too tall. So it actually is built where you lower the cab. And I believe Dave and Scott have got it where it's about an hour. Once it's offloaded from the tractor, it takes about an hour to get it transformed into operating mode. And same thing to get it ready for transport. So it's a pain. You need a CDL for somebody to drive it around. This isn't something you just put on your aluminum trailer and haul it with a pickup truck. It's way too big.
Okay, great. Thanks. We're going to move on. Any more questions that you think of, please do enter them in the Q&A. We'll get them answered at some point or another. And also, just to note, if you are looking for another question, if you can go through and you can check the answered questions here. And I don't know whether or not you can see the dismissed questions, but if you want to go find an old question, find the answer, that's how you do it. Okay, so moving on here, we have our plant nursery showcase for the next half an hour here. So we'll be talking with Paul Merritt, who is co-owner and manager of Nine Hazels Farm in Lake City. He and his partners, Santa Merritt and Steve Goldsmith, have taken over Norm Erickson Farm to carry on the mission of what was formerly the Hazelnut Valley Farm. And following that, we'll have Mark Heyman, who has some deep experience with hazelnut propagation. And we'll be having a new opportunity to sell us hazelnut seedlings, I believe. So stick around for Nine Hazels Farm and the Experimental Farm Network. So, Paul, are you there? Are you able to share screen?
Hello?
Hello.
You see and hear me okay?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone who's contributed to this conference. This is our first year, and it's been nice to, at least virtually see some faces and learn more about what everyone is up to. And we look forward to a time when we can actually get together in person and socialize a bit more. I made it easy on myself and pre-recorded a little presentation here. So I'm gonna share my screen in a second and play that. Just introducing us and the farm and what we'll have for sale this fall. And then if there's any questions, I can try and answer those after I play the video.
Paul, when you share your screen, make sure you click the button at the bottom of the screen that allows for the sound.
Got it. Okay, can we see the video player here?
Yep.
Hello, my name is Paul Murray, and you can see Sana in the back of this picture. Together with her father, Stephen Goldsmith, we run Nine Hazels Farm, a source of high-quality, hybrid hazel seedlings. We're a small regenerative family farm just outside Lake City, Minnesota, surrounded by sandstone bluffs a mile south of the Great Mississippi River. You may know us as Hazelnut Valley Farm, run by Norm and Mary Erickson. We purchased the farm from Norm and Mary and began running things under their guidance in early 2020. We've learned a great deal from them, as well as Lois Braun of the University of Minnesota, whose hazelnut research we continue to host. Having grown up in nearby Rochester, Minnesota, it's been wonderful to make this piece of Midwest paradise our home. We're honored to build on the legacy of those who have made this farm so great and are committed to furthering its development sustainably. Our hazels are hybrids of the native Corylus americana and Corylus cornuta, along with the European Corylus avellana. As many of you know, the hybridization of these species resulted in hazels that are extremely cold tolerant and resistant to eastern filbert blight, with larger nuts on average than wild hazels. Our oldest hybrid hazels came from Badgerset and were planted in 2004 by Norm and Mary Erickson. They continued planting seedlings and culling less impressive specimens for over a decade to produce the grove of 4,000-some hazels we now care for. Their dedication to hazel breeding has yielded great results. One of the hybrid hazels that the Ericksons bred, Eric 421, was selected by the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative to further propagate and evaluate its potential. In the fall, we scout out exceptional hazels and pick them for seed nuts. There's no guarantee that the resulting seedlings will be as impressive as the parents, but we do what we can in our open pollinated environment. Starting with the 2020 harvest, we're now keeping track of exactly which hazels our seed nuts are coming from. This fall, we will be selling year 2 open pollinated seedlings, as well as these year 1 half-sibling seedlings. Depending on availability, you'll be able to choose half-sibling seedlings from a couple different hazels. We will have more information on the mother hazels in the coming months. All seedlings are $9. We will also be offering a portion of our 2021 hazelnut harvest for sale as seed nuts, at $12 a pound, for those interested in cold stratifying and planting their own nuts. Seedlings are available for farm pickup sales only, but we will be happy to ship seed nuts. Seed nuts will be listed on our website this fall so you can see what shipping costs will be. Those already involved in Midwest Hazels know Norm Erickson and this farm as a passionate and impactful contributor. In addition to an exceptional hybrid hazel grove that speaks for itself, there are several reasons to buy your seedlings from Nine Hazels Farm. From a values perspective, we're small scale and local. We're also contributing to hazel development in the Midwest through our hosting of research trials and our own emerging projects. Sana is beginning to bring her GIS background to the work we do here, mapping hazelnut size and yield and pest incidents per row. She plans to share her results and methodology with the community in the near future. Finally, purchasing our seedlings means supporting sustainability and the advancement of Norm Erickson's vision. Norm still comes out here all the time, and we're intent on preserving and building on his legacy. Last year, we worked with him to complete the inner workings of the passive solar and geothermal greenhouse. Looking to the future, we plan to invest any profit into continued hazel breeding efforts, native prairie restoration and permaculture landscape establishment in our non-hazel acreage, as well as additional renewable energy sources for the farm. Here's a look at some hazel rows during the 2020 harvest. I'd like to take a moment to thank those who have welcomed, worked, and shared their knowledge with us, including Norman Mary Erickson, Lois Braun, Mark Hammond, Jason Fishbach, Linda Meschke, Jim Mickelson, Haley Stanovich, and Lindsay Rabin. Your generosity and enthusiasm helped make our first year a great success. Thanks to Linda Meschke, Rural Advantage, UMN Forever Green Initiative, and UMN Regional Sustainable Development Initiative for hosting this conference and letting us share a bit about our farm. And thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, interest in hazel seedlings, our hazelnut processing services, or other products, or if you have any ideas for future projects or collaboration, there are several ways to contact us. You can learn more about us at ninehazelsfarm.com, email us at ninehazelsfarm@gmail.com, or give me a call at 507-261-3864. If you're in the area, stop by and say hello sometime. We're also on Facebook if you're into that. Again, thanks from Sana, Steve, and me. We hope to see and hear from you soon.
All right, thank you. Any questions that come in, we will address them as they show up. In the meantime, we can get Mark Hammond's presentation up and loaded.
Hey, can you hear me?
Can hear you. Yep.
Okay. Let me. All right, you seen the slideshow?
We can see you. Yep.
Okay. Wow. So, hi everybody, thank you. Yeah, my name is Mark Hammond, and me and my friend and business partner, Dusty Hins, are growing and selling seedlings from Badger Set's breeding program. And the Experimental Farm Network is the name of Dusty's business, and that's how we're going to be marketing them, at least this year. And there will be, the contact info will be, and how to find us will be at the end of the presentation. So I put this in because I think this is the first PowerPoint I've had to put together in like 10 years, and I hope it turns out okay. Anyways, so I think most people here are probably familiar with Badger Set, but I thought I'd just throw this in quick for people who are new. So Badger Set Research Corporation, Badger Set Research Farm was founded by its CEO and head honcho and friend and mentor of mine, Philip Rudder, around 1980. And their program, their farm, is the direct or indirect source of most of the hybrid hazels in the upper Midwest, or that have been grown and tested for a long period of time in the upper Midwest, particularly in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And it's the direct or indirect source of all of the UMHDI's clonal bush type hazel selections. either directly from Badger Set or usually in the other case from Mark Shepard's breeding program, Gene Pool, which came from Badger Set originally. Also others like Arbor Day, Red Fern Farm, and a couple others. So I put this information in here. I'm not really going to get into it, but it's just about the foundation stock from Badger Set. Basically, there were three main sources, the largest and most important of which was from Carl Weschke's in River Falls, Wisconsin. And they have been recrossed and reselected at Badger Set probably, I don't know, at least two or three times, sometimes up to 4 times since the initial generation at Badger Set that was planted in the early 80s. I worked for Badger Set from the fall of 2015 until late August 2018. As a disclaimer, my current job is as Lois Braun's assistant at the University of Minnesota, but this is a side project. It's not a university thing, and it's not endorsed by the university in any particular way. My friend Dusty, who's my business partner, worked at Badger Set for in the 2018 growing season and had come out for harvest a couple other times, and he's a local in Minneapolis. For the bushes that we're growing, Philip Rudder, founder, CEO of Badger Set, is the one selecting the bushes for seed. Basically, Badger Set has fallen on hard times in the last 5 years or so, and they really haven't been able to have their greenhouse business functioning and delivering plants to customers. So we're hoping to pick up the slack and keep making that plant material available. And our aim is to produce about 3,000 plants this year. That's me on the right holding the sorghum leaf. That's Dusty on the left. In the middle, that's Ashanti, who's Dusty's partner at the time. And that's Philip. I'm embarrassed to say I don't have a photo of Philip where his face isn't cut off, so I apologize for that. This is from our seed collection trip in early August. So our plants come from a pretty large expansion planting of seedlings from about 40 of Badger Set's most advanced breeding lines. It was planted in 2003 on a farm in northwestern Illinois. Excuse me. And it's about an 8-acre planting. If you sort of were to take everything and squish it down onto single continuous acreage, it's about 5 acres of plants planted 18 inches to 3 feet apart on 10-foot alternating 10-foot 15-foot rows. So it's thousands and thousands of plants. Our plants are currently being selected from, it's basically Philip is making the choices from breeding lines and from particular plants of particular breeding lines that he really likes. The entire planting is mapped. We know the seed parent of every plant that is in that planting. But the pollen cloud is currently uncontrolled. So we don't know who dad is, and that has advantages, some advantages and a lot of disadvantages for breeding purposes. So the disclaimers that Jason has laid out about seedlings are good. I'm going to skip, I have this out of order. That's the basic message about growing seedling plants. There are really good reasons to grow seedling plants as a hobby, for sort of really small scale growing, breeding, as pollen for improved varieties, gaining experience, all those things, but there's nobody has made any money trying to do commercial growing with seedlings at this point. So the base of the plants, they should be rock hardy for rock solid, cold hardy for USDA zones 4 to 6. They're probably reasonable to try in 3 to 7. You can probably expect some of the plants to not work in 3 to 7. One of the advantages of the planting, besides it being mapped and knowing the identities, or at least half of the identities of all the plants, is that it's a really well-established pest and disease ecosystem for making selections for plants that are resistant to all of the kinds of pests and diseases that hazels in the upper Midwest can be exposed to. Big bud mite has been in that field since at least 2009. EFB has been shot through it since probably 2007 or 2008. The stem borer has been there for a long time. So it allows us to make selections where we can make a reasonable guess. Again, these are individual plants, they're not replicated, they're not cloned, but when you're able to walk down a row of seedlings that are all from one breeding line and see, this one is completely infested with big bud mite, there's big bud mite everywhere, and then the next plant has very little or moderate amounts, you can make pretty educated guesses about the characteristics of that plant. EFB, most of these plants were from breeding lines that were already EFB resistant or tolerant when they were planted. So almost all of the plants there are resistant or tolerant. The ones that aren't have mostly died or have really withered away to a very small part of the planting. So Badger Set's expectation, which I'm communicating, is something like 90 to 95% of the plants should be just fine for EFB. The other things we selected are the size of the kernel and the size and shape of the bush. Another nice thing about having these plantings mapped is where the plantings change from. These are seedlings of this female parent to these are seedlings of another female parent. And the kernel size and yield are harder and more complicated traits to figure out, but just from walking down the row and looking at them, the size and the shape of the bushes is pretty consistent. And we expect that to be the same. So part of what we offer are seedlings from tall bushes or short bushes, depending on what you want. Short probably means up to 9 feet tall. Tall can be anywhere from 10 feet to, at this point, 18 feet, maybe even taller if you don't coppice them or prune them. But tall will probably top out somewhere around 12 to 15 feet. And probably the most important factor that we're selecting on is selecting from bushes from breeding lines that have been generally consistent and productive in the past, and that are plants that, at least when we're looking at them, have nice kernels big enough to process and good looking yields, some of them quite heavy looking. Again, that's unreplicated information. We want to be doing this over more years, and we want clones of these plants, but it's a good starting point. So yeah, upsides, lots of diversity, adaptability to pests and diseases. Diversity also can be an enormous downside. We're tapping into Badger Set Phillips' experience with his breeding lines, with his knowledge of his plants, some of which you can look at a plant and go, this thing's, data from this thing's grandmother from 1987, which none of it is perfect information, but it's a good starting point. And yeah, if you grow seedlings, you get to be a hazel breeder if you want to. The expectation is that probably half of these will make, decent to good crops of nuts. And based on Badger Set's predictions and also the experience that other people have had with seedlings, the cream of the crop should be really, really nice stuff. And that's what we need people finding and working with on a large scale. And downsides, diversity, yeah, a bunch of these plants, it's inherent with seedlings. Some of them will be mediocre and some will just be junk. They will cast pollen if that's all that you want from them. Excuse me, but if you're looking for nut production, the idea is to plant densely and try to find the ones that are performing better at your site, and cut out the ones that are in the way and taking up space but not doing much else. And a lot of the data is sort of soft data, observational, making inspired hypotheses about breeding combinations or how consistent a breeding line is performing, which I think is valuable, but we wish we had more hard numbers behind it, and the hope is to develop that more in the years to come. Yep, again, don't bet the farm. They're worthwhile plants to grow for a lot of reasons, but nobody's promising commercial profitability. So if you want to order plants, we're selling basically you can order from tall or short parents because that's pretty highly heritable. It's not guaranteed, but it's highly heritable. Tall is taller than 10 feet. Some can be really tall with really thick wood, like a really classic European hazel look. Some of them are sort of more of like a medium height. The wood isn't necessarily really huge or really thick, but it's not quite short enough to let them keep growing and growing and still be able to machine harvest them. Short seedlings should top out around 9 or 10 feet. And that fits the olive harvester beautifully, and it mostly fits the blueberry harvesters. The blueberry harvesters can bend them over a little bit. And yeah, each flat will have a mixture of parents that either have a large nut or a medium nut themselves, and so half and half, something like that. And it's not a guarantee of the size of the children, but it's a good start. And we also offer for like a $5 fee per flat, $5 fee per flat. The breeding ID, so the identity of the specific mother plant that your plants come from, which I think is useful. It makes sense to plant, a row or a section of row all from this parent, and the next one all from this parent, so you can see whatever patterns you see, and it can also, it should help make a harvest more efficient. And it's good to know the mother parent if you find any exceptional plants. That's useful information to have for the long term. I'm 6'5". That's me standing next to bushes that are in need of being coppiced, but that is probably what you would expect, like the height of tall bushes to look like. They're probably 11 to 15 feet. So they can get pretty big. I don't advise letting them get that big. It's nice to keep them more manageable, but that's sort of what you would expect for tall stuff. And so we're selling two different kinds of plants. They're either Rootmaker 32 cell or Rootmaker 18 cell propagation flats. They're going to be 3 to 4 months old, actively grown in a greenhouse. How much time do I have? Okay. Pickup is going to be, they're for pickup only in Minneapolis at this point. It'll be in June. You have to order whole flats. So, 18 or 32. We also are planning to, we don't have it on the website yet, but we're planning to outplant some of these to grow as bare root dormant to dig and then be able to ship those. We basically just don't want to deal with shipping actively growing plants in the summertime this year. So we will have the option for bare root dormant for digging and shipping either in the fall or next spring if you're interested in that. How to plant, I won't really get into this. If you do want to directly field plant things out of the propagation flats, it can work. They have different rules. It's different than growing a bare root dormant plant or a really large potted plant. They take a little more aftercare after they're planted, especially fertility and weed control, but they are less expensive. It also works to uppot them to a larger pot for planting in the fall, or planting them out in a nursery bed if you want to dig them up and do bare root yourself. Yep, 18 cell flat is $160. It's about a pint of soil volume. 32 cell flat is 180, so about $5.50 per plant as opposed to about 9. And that's about a cup of soil volume. That's the website where you can order. Pickup is in Minneapolis in June. We'll be in touch. And for more info, that's how to get a hold of us. Thanks. Okay.
All right, thank you guys. If anybody has any questions for our nursery folks or our hazelnut growers, please take the opportunity to go to the question and answer and throw something in there. Otherwise, or until I'm waiting for questions to pop in, I will move it over to Linda Meschke to close us down. Linda, you're muted. Sorry.
All right.
There you go.
Sorry. I just have a few closing comments. I'd just like to thank our sponsors, Rural Advantage, University of Minnesota, the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships with the University of Minnesota, USDA NIFA, and the Forever Green Initiative at the university. I'd like to thank everyone for participating. We had 271 total participants. That's not counting anyone twice. Next week, you should receive a conference survey in your email, and we'd like you to fill it out and provide feedback so we can improve future conferences. And I'd like you all to mark your calendar for the first Friday, Saturday in March of 2022. That'll be the 4th and the 5th of March. And I believe we'll be traveling to Wisconsin, and Jason will be our host next year. I'd also like to thank the planning committee, Jason Fishbach, who provided a lot of presentations, and he's got extensive knowledge of the topics. Greg Schweizer, Connie Carlson, Lois Brown, and especially Anna Peterson, who helped with all the IT and made sure all of it worked and went well throughout the conference. So thank you, everyone. Have a good year.